Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight, we bring you 6 deeply disturbing true trucker horror stories that will make you question what really happens on America's most isolated highways when darkness falls. These are not fictional tales, but real encounters shared by professional drivers who have spent decades navigating the loneliest stretches of interstate where civilization fades and something far more sinister takes its place. Each story has been carefully researched and verified through witness testimonials, police reports, and corroborating evidence from the trucking community itself. America's highways hold secrets that most drivers will never encounter, and perhaps that is for the best. From predatory schemes targeting vulnerable truckers to supernatural encounters that defy explanation, tonight we explore the hidden dangers that lurk beyond the reach of headlights. If you enjoy authentic horror content that exposes the terrifying reality behind closed doors, subscribe to Buried Files and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the darkest corners of American highways. After you listen to these chilling accounts, we want to hear from you in the comments below about your own experiences on the road or encounters with the unexplained. Now settle in as we journey into the darkness that travels alongside America's truckers. I have been hauling freight across the mountain states for 18 years, and I thought I had seen every kind of scam, every type of roadside desperation, and every variation of human greed that the interstate could throw at me. I was wrong. What happened to me on that snow-covered stretch of Wyoming highway during the blizzard of February 2019 still haunts my sleep and makes me question every stranded motorist I pass. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I drive a Peterbilt 379 pulling a 53-foot refrigerated trailer for a logistics company based out of Denver. The run that night was supposed to be routine. I was hauling frozen goods from Salt Lake City to Billings, Montana, a route I had driven countless times before. The weather forecast called for light snow, maybe 3 to 4 inches, nothing that would slow down an experienced driver like myself. But Wyoming weather has a mind of its own, and by the time I hit the stretch between Rock Springs and Rawlins, the light snow had transformed into a full-blown blizzard. The wind was howling across the open plains, creating whiteout conditions that reduced visibility to maybe 50 feet on a good stretch. My CB radio crackled with chatter from other drivers reporting jackknifed semis, cars in ditches, and road closures further north. I should have pulled over at the next truck stop and waited it out. Any sensible driver would have. But I was behind schedule, and the company had been breathing down our necks about delivery times. The customer in Billings needed those frozen foods for their morning shipment, and a delay would cost us the contract. So I pressed on, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles as my headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the swirling snow. The highway was nearly deserted. Most smart people had found shelter hours ago, leaving only the foolish and the desperate to battle the elements. My truck crept along at 30 miles per hour, the engine working hard to maintain traction on the ice-slicked asphalt. The heater was running full blast, but the cold seemed to seep through every crack and crevice, chilling me to the bone despite my heavy winter coat. That was when I saw her. At first, she was just a shadow in the storm, a dark shape moving along the shoulder of the road. As I got closer, my headlights illuminated a young woman in a thin jacket, no hat, no gloves, waving frantically at passing vehicles. She looked to be in her early 20s, with long, dark hair whipping around her face in the wind. Even through the storm, I could see she was shivering violently, her breath creating clouds of vapor that were immediately torn away by the gale. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving. Picking up hitchhikers was against company policy, and in weather like this, stopping could mean getting stuck myself. But as I passed her, I caught a glimpse of her face in my side mirror, She looked terrified, desperate, and hypothermic. No one deserved to die, alone on a highway in a blizzard. Company policy be damned. I pulled over about 100 yards ahead, hazard lights flashing, and watched in my mirrors as she stumbled through the snow toward my truck. She was moving slowly, her legs apparently stiff from cold, and I could see her struggling against the wind with each step. When she reached the passenger door, I leaned over and opened it from the inside. She practically fell into the cab, bringing a swirl of snow and frigid air with her. Up close, she looked even younger, maybe 19 or 20, with pale skin that had taken on a bluish tint from the cold. Her lips were purple, and her teeth were chattering so violently she could barely speak. "Thank you," she managed to gasp between chattering teeth. "Thank you so much. I thought I was going to die out there." I grabbed a spare blanket from behind my seat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "What the hell are you doing out here in this weather?" I asked, shifting the truck back into gear and pulling carefully onto the highway. "Where's your car?" She pulled the blanket tighter around herself and held her hands up to the heating vents. "It broke down about 5 miles back," she said, her voice still shaking. "The engine just died, and I couldn't get it started again. I've been walking for over an hour." "Why didn't you stay with the car? That's the first rule of winter survival. Never leave your vehicle." She shook her head, snowflakes still melting in her dark hair. "The heater stopped working when the engine died. I was getting so cold and no one was stopping. I figured if I walked, maybe I could find a gas station or flag down help." It made sense, I supposed, though it was still incredibly dangerous. Hypothermia could cloud judgment, make people do irrational things. I reached for my CB radio to call for assistance. "What's your name?" "I'll radio ahead to the state patrol, let them know about your car." "Sarah," she said quickly. "Sarah Miller. And thank you. But could we maybe wait until we get somewhere warm? I just want to get feeling back in my fingers first." Something about her response struck me as odd, but I attributed it to the stress of her situation. Hypothermia and shock could make anyone act strangely. I focused on the road ahead, fighting to keep the truck centered in the lane as crosswinds buffeted us from all sides. "Where are you headed?" I asked, making conversation to keep her alert. People with hypothermia could slip into unconsciousness if they got too comfortable. "Rollins," she said. "I have family there. They're expecting me." "Good. That's where I'm headed too. We should be there in about an hour if this weather doesn't get any worse." She nodded and settled back into the passenger seat, the blanket still wrapped tightly around her. For the next 20 minutes, we drove in relative silence, the only sounds being the rumble of the diesel engine, the whistle of wind around the cab, and the occasional squawk from the CB radio. That was when I noticed the headlights in my mirrors. At first, I thought it was just another truck or a snowplow catching up to us. But as I watched, I realized there were 3 sets of headlights maintaining a steady distance behind us. In a blizzard like this, most vehicles would either pass quickly or fall behind. These were keeping pace, staying about a quarter-mile back, just visible through the storm. I glanced over at Sarah, who seemed to be dozing fitfully in the passenger seat. Her breathing had returned to normal, and some color had come back to her cheeks. The immediate danger of hypothermia was past, but something else was bothering me now. "Sarah," I said gently, "those vehicles behind us, are they with you?" Her eyes snapped open, and for just a moment, I saw something that chilled me more than the Wyoming wind. It was a look of calculation, of predatory awareness that had nothing to do with being a stranded motorist. But it was gone so quickly, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. "What vehicles?" she asked, turning to look in the passenger side mirror. "I don't see anything." "Those headlights, 3 sets, staying right behind us." She squinted into the storm. "I can barely see anything in this snow. Maybe it's just other people trying to get to safety, like us." Maybe. But 18 years on the road had taught me to trust my instincts. And every instinct I had was now screaming that something was wrong. I had seen this pattern before in CB radio chatter from other drivers. Coordinated vehicles following a target, waiting for the right moment to strike. I kept my voice casual. "You know, I just realized I should probably call this in to dispatch. Let them know I picked up a passenger." I reached for the CB radio again. "No." The word came out sharper than she probably intended. She quickly softened her tone. "I mean, could we wait? I'm still feeling pretty shaky, and I'd rather not deal with official stuff right now." Red flags were going up all over my mental radar now. I had picked up stranded motorists before, and they were always grateful for any help, eager to get in touch with authorities or family members. Sarah's reluctance to involve anyone else was setting off every alarm bell I had. I glanced in my mirrors again. The 3 sets of headlights were still there, and now I was certain they were maintaining a deliberate formation. 2 were hanging back in the right lane, 1 in the left, positioned to block any attempt at escape if I tried to change lanes or exit the highway. "Sarah," I said carefully, "I need you to be honest with me. Are you really stranded? Or is this some kind of setup?" The mask dropped completely then. Her shivering stopped, her posture straightened, and when she looked at me, her eyes were cold and calculating. "You're a smart one, Marcus. Most drivers don't figure it out until it's too late." My blood turned to ice water. She knew my name. I had never told her my name. "How do you know?" "Your company puts driver names on the truck doors, genius. We've been tracking you since you left the Flying J in Rock Springs. You've got a refrigerated trailer full of expensive frozen goods, and more importantly, you're driving alone through the middle of nowhere in a blizzard." I looked ahead and realized we were approaching the exit for a rest area. If this was a coordinated robbery, that would be the perfect place for it. Isolated, off the main highway, easy to control. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What do you want?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Pull off at the rest area ahead. My friends will take the trailer and you'll walk away. Try to be a hero and you won't walk away at all." The CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker 19, this is Wyoming Bear. We've got multiple reports of a hijacking crew working I-80 tonight. 3 vehicles working together, using a female decoy to flag down trucks. All drivers exercise extreme caution." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Too bad you won't be able to respond to that warning." But I was already formulating a plan. The rest area was still 2 miles ahead, and I had one advantage she didn't know about. My truck was equipped with a silent alarm system that could alert law enforcement and my dispatch office with the push of a hidden button. I had installed it myself after hearing too many horror stories from other drivers. "You know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "you picked the wrong truck to mess with." "What's that supposed to mean?" Instead of answering, I pushed the hidden alarm button with my left hand, while simultaneously flooring the accelerator with my right foot. The big Caterpillar engine roared to life, and the truck surged forward through the snow. Sarah was thrown back in her seat. "What are you doing? You'll get us both killed in this weather. Better than letting you and your friends kill me in that rest area." I grabbed the CB radio and keyed the microphone. "Mayday, mayday. This is eastbound Peterbilt mile marker 184 on I-80. I have been hijacked by a female subject and 3 chase vehicles, requesting immediate assistance. The response was immediate. Peterbilt eastbound I-80. This is Wyoming State Patrol. We have units en route to your location. Can you maintain your current speed and direction? Affirmative. I'm going to try to make it to the truck stop in Rawlins. Sarah pulled a small pistol from inside her jacket. Pull over now, or I'll put a bullet in you. I looked in my mirrors. The 3 chase vehicles had accelerated as well, and were now closing the gap rapidly. They had been caught off guard by my sudden burst of speed, but they were recovering quickly. Go ahead and shoot, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. At this speed, in this weather, you'll kill us both when the truck crashes. Your friends back there won't get anything but a pile of scrap metal. She hesitated, and in that moment of uncertainty, I saw something that gave me hope. Flashing red and blue lights were approaching from ahead, barely visible through the storm, but getting brighter by the second. The Wyoming State Patrol had responded faster than I had dared hope. Sarah saw the lights too. Her face went pale, and she looked between me and the approaching police cars with growing panic. This isn't over, she snarled. Yeah, it is. The next few minutes were a blur of flashing lights, radio chatter, and controlled chaos. The state patrol vehicles had set up a roadblock just past the rest area exit, and my 3 pursuers had no choice but to stop or crash. Sarah made one last desperate attempt to escape, opening the passenger door while the truck was still moving. But the combination of speed and snow made it impossible. By the time everything was sorted out, I learned that Sarah and her crew had been responsible for at least 6 truck hijackings over the past 3 months. They had stolen over $2 million worth of cargo and had seriously injured 2 drivers who had tried to resist. The most chilling part came when the state patrol detective interviewed me at the truck stop in Rawlins. You're lucky you figured it out when you did, he said. The last driver who fell for their routine was found dead in his cab at that same rest area 3 weeks ago. They're not just thieves, Mr. Thompson. They're killers. I finished my run to Billings the next day, but I never forgot that night on the Wyoming highway. Every time I see a stranded motorist now, I call it into the authorities instead of stopping myself. The memory of Sarah's cold eyes and the calculating way she used my own compassion against me changed something fundamental about how I view the world. The highway is a dangerous place, and sometimes the greatest threats come not from the weather or mechanical failures, but from the darkness that lives in human hearts. Trust is a luxury that truck drivers can no longer afford, and that realization saddens me more than I can express. But I am alive to tell this story, and that is more than some drivers can say. You learn to trust your instincts out here, or you do not survive. That is the first lesson every trucker learns, usually the hard way. After 26 years hauling loads across 48 states, I thought my instincts were bulletproof. I thought I could spot trouble coming from miles away. What happened to me at that rest stop in East Texas proved just how wrong a man can be. My name is David Rodriguez, but everyone on the CB calls me Big Dave. I drive a 2018 Kenworth W900 with a custom paint job that cost me more than most people make in 6 months. Deep, metallic blue with silver flames running down the sides, chrome stacks that shine like mirrors, and enough LED lights to illuminate a small town. Some drivers think I am showing off, but that truck is my pride and joy, my home away from home, and the tool of my trade all rolled into one. The run that night started out routine enough. I was hauling electronics from Dallas to Jacksonville, a familiar route that I had driven probably 50 times over the years. The load was valuable, worth close to $500,000 in computer components and smartphones, which meant I had to be extra careful about where I stopped and who I talked to. Cargo thieves love electronics because they are easy to move and hard to trace. I had been driving for 9 hours straight when fatigue started setting in. The law says you can drive 11 hours before you have to take a mandatory 10-hour break, but smart drivers know not to push it that far. Tired drivers make mistakes, and mistakes on the highway can kill you. So when I saw the sign for the Pine Ridge Rest Area, I decided it was time to call it a night. The rest area was one of those older state-maintained facilities that Texas.com has scattered throughout the eastern part of the state. Nothing fancy, just a parking lot, some picnic tables, restrooms, and a few vending machines. It was set back about half a mile from the main highway, surrounded by thick pine forest that blocked out most of the light pollution from the road. During the day, it was probably a pleasant enough spot for travelers to stretch their legs and let their kids run around. At night, it felt isolated and vulnerable. I pulled into the truck parking section and chose a spot near the back, away from the main building but with a clear view of both entrances to the rest area. Old habits from my early days, when I was more paranoid about security. I shut down the engine, locked the doors, and climbed into the sleeper berth to grab a few hours of rest before continuing on to Jacksonville. The sleeper berth in my Kenworth is practically a small apartment. Full-size bed, television, refrigerator, microwave, even a small desk where I can do paperwork or browse the internet when I have a good signal. I had just settled in with a sandwich and was scrolling through messages on my phone when I heard it for the first time. A child screaming. It was faint at first, barely audible, over the hum of my auxiliary power unit. But it was definitely there. A high-pitched wail of terror and pain that seemed to be coming from somewhere in the woods beyond the rest area. I sat up immediately, every parental instinct I had firing at once. I have 3 kids of my own, and that sound triggered something primal in me. I opened the sleeper berth curtain and looked out the side window toward the tree line. The rest area was dimly lit by a few security lights mounted on poles around the parking lot. But beyond that, the pine forest was a wall of impenetrable darkness. The screaming continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. Silence. I waited, listening intently, but heard nothing except the distant hum of highway traffic and the occasional rustle of wind through the pine branches. Maybe it had been an animal, I told myself. Foxes could make sounds that were eerily similar to human screams, especially when they were fighting or mating. But the rational part of my brain knew the difference between animal sounds and human ones. And what I had heard was definitely human. I grabbed my flashlight and cell phone and climbed down from the cab. The night air was thick with humidity and the smell of pine sap. Texas in August is never comfortable, but there was something oppressive about the atmosphere that night, like the air itself was holding its breath. I walked toward the tree line, following the direction the screams had seemed to come from. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating maybe 20 feet of forest at a time. Pine trees, undergrowth, nothing unusual. I called out, "Hello? Is someone out there? Do you need help?" No response. I walked a little deeper into the woods, sweeping my flashlight back and forth, looking for any sign of movement or distress. The forest floor was covered with a thick carpet of pine needles that muffled my footsteps, and every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. After about 10 minutes of searching, I was ready to give up and head back to my truck when I heard it again. The screaming. This time it was louder, more urgent, and it seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods. But there was something wrong with it. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The scream was too consistent, too uniform. Real screams of terror vary in pitch and intensity as people run out of breath or their voices crack from strain. This sounded almost recorded. I stopped walking and listened more carefully. The scream continued for exactly 30 seconds, then cut off with an electronic click that was barely audible. Then, after a pause of maybe 10 seconds, it started again. Same pitch, same duration, same abrupt ending. It was recorded. Someone was playing a recording of a child screaming in the middle of the woods at a remote rest area at 2 o'clock in the morning. Every alarm bell in my head started going off at once. This was a trap. Someone was using that, recording to lure good Samaritans into the woods, probably to rob them or worse. I had heard stories from other drivers about rest area predators, but I had never encountered one myself. I turned around and started walking quickly back toward the parking lot, my flashlight sweeping left and right to make sure no one was following me. The screaming continued behind me, that same 30-second loop playing over and over again. Whoever was running this operation was either very confident or very stupid to keep the recording going even after their intended victim had clearly figured out what was happening. I made it back to the parking lot and was heading for my truck when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a man standing next to my Kenworth, looking up at the sleeper berth windows. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothing that made him hard to see in the dim light. When he heard my footsteps, he turned toward me. "Hey there, driver," he called out in a friendly voice that did not match the predatory way he was moving. "You hear that screaming? Sounds like some kid is in trouble out there in the woods." I kept walking toward my truck, but I was already reaching for the can of bear spray I kept clipped to my belt. "Yeah, I heard it. Already called the cops. They should be here any minute." It was a lie, but I hoped it would make him back off. Instead, he smiled, and even in the dim light, I could see that it was not a pleasant expression. "That is funny," he said, taking a step closer to me, "because my buddy out there in the woods has been watching you for the past 15 minutes, and he says you never made any phone calls." That was when I saw the second man emerging from the shadows near the restroom building. He was shorter than the first one, but broader, built like a linebacker. He had something in his hand that caught the light as he moved. A knife, maybe, or a metal pipe. I was trapped between them, about 30 feet from my truck. The keys were in my pocket, but even if I could get to the cab and get the engine started, they would be on me before I could get moving. My only advantage was that I outweighed both of them by at least 50 pounds and had been in more than my share of fights during my younger, stupider days. "Look, fellas," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. "I do not know what you are planning here, but it is not worth it. My load is just electronics. Insurance will cover whatever you take, and I will not even report it until tomorrow. Just take what you want and let me go." The tall one laughed. "Electronics? Brother, you think this is about cargo? You have got it all wrong." The short one had moved closer, circling around to cut off my escape route toward the rest area entrance. "We are not cargo thieves, driver. We are collectors." "Collectors? We collect drivers," the tall one explained, still smiling that horrible smile. "Some we keep for a while, some we sell, some we just play with until we get bored. But they all end up the same way, eventually." The screaming in the woods had stopped, but now I could hear something else. Voices. Multiple voices coming from the direction of the trees, calling out in what sounded like distress. But just like the screaming, something about those voices was wrong. They were too clear, too distinct, like they were being amplified somehow. Speakers, I said, understanding flooding through me. You have speakers set up in the woods, playing recordings to lure people out there. Smart man, the tall one said. Too bad smart will not help you now. That was when I made my move. Instead of going for my truck like they expected, I sprinted toward the restroom building. It was not much of a shelter, but the walls were concrete block and there might be a back exit. More importantly, it would force them to come at me from a predictable direction instead of surrounding me in the open parking lot. I almost made it. The short one was faster than he looked, and he tackled me about 10 feet from the building entrance. We went down hard on the asphalt, and I felt the skin scrape off my palms and elbows. But adrenaline is a hell of a drug, and I barely felt the pain. I rolled over and caught him with an uppercut that snapped his head back and sent him sprawling. The tall one was on me before I could get to my feet, swinging what looked like a tire iron at my head. I got my arm up just in time to block the blow, but the impact sent lightning bolts of pain up to my shoulder. He raised the tire iron for another swing, and I knew that this one would probably finish me. That was when the real screaming started. Not from speakers hidden in the woods, but from the tall man himself. He dropped the tire iron and clutched at his face, blood streaming between his fingers. Behind him, I could see a third figure, someone I had not noticed before. It was another trucker, a woman with graying hair and forearms like tree trunks. She was holding what looked like a modified cattle prod, sparks still dancing between the electrodes. Texas Ranger, she announced in a voice that carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Y'all gentlemen are under arrest. The next hour was a blur of police cars, ambulances, and crime scene technicians. It turned out that the woman who had saved me was Detective Linda Martinez, working undercover as part of a multi-state task force investigating rest area attacks. She had been tracking this particular crew for over 6 months, following a trail of missing truckers and unsolved murders across 4 states. The speakers in the woods were exactly what I had suspected. High-powered amplifiers connected to digital players loaded with recordings of people in distress. The 2 men had been using them to lure victims into isolated areas where they could be more easily controlled. What they did to their victims after that was something Detective Martinez would not discuss in detail. But her expression told me everything I needed to know. "You are lucky you figured out it was a recording," she told me as the paramedics checked out my injuries. Most people do not. They hear a child in distress, and every decent instinct they have drives them straight into the trap. How many drivers have they killed? Her face went grim. We have confirmed 7 victims so far, but we suspect the number is much higher. These guys have been operating for at least 3 years, maybe longer. 7 drivers, 7 people who had just been trying to help someone they thought was in trouble, and it had cost them their lives. The thought made me sick to my stomach. I gave my statement to the investigators and finally got back on the road around dawn. The electronics made it to Jacksonville on schedule, and the company was so grateful that they gave me a bonus and 3 days of paid time off. But I could not stop thinking about what had happened at that rest area. The worst part was not the physical danger or even the knowledge of how close I had come to becoming victim number 8. It was the realization of how these predators operated, how they turned our best instincts against us. They knew that most truckers are decent people who will try to help someone in trouble, and they weaponized that decency. Now, whenever I stop at a rest area, I listen carefully to the night sounds around me. If I hear screaming or calls for help, I do not go investigate. I call 911 and let the professionals handle it. It goes against every instinct I have as a father and a human being. But Detective Martinez was right. Sometimes the sounds of people in distress are exactly that. And sometimes they are the bait in a trap designed by monsters. The highway is full of predators who know exactly how to exploit our humanity, and the price of compassion can be higher than anyone should have to pay. I learned that lesson at a rest stop in East Texas, and it is one I will never forget. In 23 years of driving, I thought I had seen every kind of cargo. From live animals to hazardous chemicals, from precious artwork to military equipment. I had hauled everything from wedding dresses to coffins, and nothing had ever bothered me enough to lose sleep over it. I was wrong about that. What I discovered in the back of my refrigerated trailer during that cross-country run from Atlanta to Seattle still wakes me up in the middle of the night, sweating and checking the locks on my doors. My name is Patricia Williams, but everyone calls me Patty. I've been driving big rigs since I was 25 years old, back when women truckers were rare enough to cause stares at every truck stop. I started driving because my husband walked out on me and our 2 kids, leaving me with nothing but bills and a high school education. Trucking offered good money for someone willing to work hard and spend weeks away from home, so I got my CDL and never looked back. I drive a 2220 Freightliner Cascadia, pulling a 53-foot refrigerated trailer, and I specialize in temperature-controlled loads. Pharmaceuticals, frozen foods, flowers, anything that needs to stay cold during transport. It is more complicated than dry van work, but it pays better, and after 2 decades on the road, I can handle any temperature-sensitive cargo you throw at me. The load that changed everything came through my dispatcher on a Tuesday morning in October. The pickup was at a pharmaceutical distribution center just outside Atlanta, and the destination was a medical research facility in Seattle. The shipping papers listed the cargo as biological specimens with a required temperature of -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Nothing unusual about that. I had hauled similar loads dozens of times before. What was unusual was the security. When I arrived at the pickup facility, there were 3 men in dark suits waiting for me, and they insisted on supervising the entire loading process personally. They had federal identification, CDC badges that looked legitimate, and they spoke with the kind of authority that made you not want to ask too many questions. The loading took place in a secure warehouse bay with no windows. The cargo consisted of approximately 50 stainless steel containers, each about the size of a large cooler, labeled with biohazard symbols and serial numbers. Each container was sealed with what looked like medical tape and locked with heavy-duty padlocks. The suits refused to tell me exactly what was inside, citing national security and trade secrets. But they assured me it was completely safe as long as the containers remained sealed and frozen. "Whatever you do," one of them told me as I signed the paperwork, "do not open these containers under any circumstances. If there is any problem with temperature control or if any of the seals are broken, contact us immediately." He handed me a business card with nothing but a phone number on it. "This is a matter of national importance, Miss Williams. Lives depend on these specimens reaching their destination intact." I had heard similar speeches before from clients shipping everything from experimental drugs to genetically modified seeds. Everyone thinks their cargo is the most important thing on the road. But there was something in his tone, something in the way all 3 men kept watching me, that made this feel different. More serious, more dangerous. The drive from Atlanta to Seattle normally takes about 42 hours of actual driving time, spread over 4 or 5 days with mandatory rest breaks. I plan to take my usual route through Birmingham, Little Rock, Oklahoma City, Amarillo, Albuquerque, Flagstaff, Las Vegas, and finally up through California and Oregon to Washington. It was a route I had driven probably 100 times, and I knew every truck stop, way station, and rest area along the way. For the first 2 days, everything went smoothly. The refrigeration unit maintained a steady -20 degrees, and the cargo remained secure and undisturbed. I made my scheduled stops, grabbed meals and showers, and logged my hours according to federal regulations. The only unusual thing was that twice I noticed the same black sedan following me at a distance, but I attributed that to coincidence or paranoia. It was on the third day, somewhere between Flagstaff and Las Vegas, that the refrigeration unit started acting up. I first noticed the problem when I stopped for fuel at a truck stop outside Kingman, Arizona. The temperature gauge on my dashboard was reading -15 instead of -20, and there was a yellow warning light indicating a possible compressor issue. 5 degrees might not sound like much, but when you are hauling temperature-critical cargo, even small variations can mean the difference between a successful delivery and a total loss. I called the emergency number the suits had given me, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a detailed message explaining the situation and continued driving, hoping the system would stabilize. But over the next 100 miles, the temperature continued to rise. -10, -5, 0 degrees. The yellow warning light turned red, and I could hear the compressor cycling on and off erratically. By the time I reached Las Vegas, the trailer temperature was holding steady at 10 degrees above zero. Still well below freezing, but nowhere near the -20 the cargo required. I found a truck stop with a repair bay and had a mechanic take a look at the system. "Looks like your compressor is shot," he told me after an hour of diagnostics. "I can get you a replacement, but it will take at least 12 hours to get the part and install it. Maybe longer if we run into complications." 12 hours. The cargo had already been above its required temperature for 6 hours. Another 12 would mean 18 hours total, and I had no idea how long the biological specimens could survive those conditions. I tried the emergency number again. Still no answer. That was when I made the decision that I now wish I could take back. I decided to check the cargo myself. I backed the trailer up to the loading dock and opened the rear doors. The interior was still cold enough that my breath formed clouds in the air, but it was definitely warmer than it should have been. The stainless steel containers were arranged on pallets, just as they had been loaded in Atlanta. But something was different. Several of the containers had condensation on them, indicating temperature fluctuations. More troubling, I could see that some of the medical tape seals had started to come loose. Not completely torn, but peeling around the edges where moisture had compromised the adhesive. I knew I should not open any of the containers. The men in suits had been very clear about that. But I also knew that if the cargo was compromised, I needed to document the extent of the damage for insurance purposes. And if whatever was inside was truly dangerous, I needed to know what I was dealing with. I chose one of the containers with a partially loose seal and carefully removed the medical tape. The padlock was still secure, but I had bolt cutters in my toolkit for situations just like this. The lock snapped with a metallic crack that echoed through the trailer. I lifted the lid and immediately wished I had not. Inside the container, packed in what looked like dry ice, was a human torso. No head, no arms, no legs. Just a torso. Gray, white, and obviously frozen, with surgical incision marks along the chest and abdomen. There was a plastic tag attached to one of the incision sites with a number that matched the serial number on the outside of the container. I stumbled backward, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This was not biological specimens for medical research. This was human remains, body parts, transported without proper documentation or permits. And judging by the surgical precision of the cuts, these were not accident victims or natural deaths. My hands shaking, I opened another container. A pair of human arms, severed at the shoulders with the same surgical precision. Another plastic tag, another serial number. A third container held internal organs. Heart, liver, kidneys, all carefully preserved and labeled. A fourth contained human heads, 3 of them, with the eyes and mouths sewn shut with black thread. I had stumbled onto something horrific, something that went far beyond simple cargo theft or insurance fraud. Someone was using my truck to transport human remains, body parts that had almost certainly been obtained through illegal means. And judging by the surgical quality of the dismemberment, whoever was doing this had medical training. I was about to call the police when I heard voices outside the trailer. The same voices I had heard back in Atlanta. The men in suits had found me. "Miss Williams," one of them, called out, "Step away from the cargo and come outside. We need to talk." I looked around the trailer desperately, searching for another exit. But there was only one way out, and they were blocking it. I could hear at least 3 different voices, maybe more. They knew I had seen the contents of the containers, and they were not going to let me walk away with that knowledge. "Miss Williams, we know you opened the containers. That was very unwise. Come outside so we can discuss your options." Options. That did not sound like they were planning to arrest me or call the authorities. That sounded like they were planning something much worse. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed 911, but there was no signal inside the metal trailer. I would have to get outside to make a call, and that meant walking into their trap. But staying inside was not an option either. They could simply wait me out, or worse. I grabbed the heaviest tool I could find in my kit, a large adjustable wrench, and moved toward the trailer doors. If I was going down, I was not going down without a fight. But when I looked outside, the loading dock was empty. No men in suits, no black sedan, nothing. Just the normal bustle of a busy truck stop at midday. Had I imagined the voices? Was the stress of discovering the body parts making me paranoid? I jumped down from the trailer and looked around cautiously. There were other drivers refueling their trucks, customers going in and out of the convenience store, mechanics working in the repair bays. Everything looked completely normal. Too normal. I walked around to the front of my truck and found a note tucked under the windshield wiper. It was typed on plain white paper with no letterhead or identifying marks. "Miss Williams, you have seen something you were not supposed to see. For your own safety and the safety of your family, you will complete this delivery as originally planned. You will not contact law enforcement. You will not discuss this cargo with anyone. When you reach Seattle, you will be given further instructions. Your cooperation ensures that this remains a business transaction rather than a personal matter." At the bottom of the note were 2 photographs. One showed my daughter coming out of her apartment in Phoenix. The other showed my son leaving his job at a construction company in Denver. Both photos had been taken recently, probably within the last few days. The message was clear: complete the delivery or my children would pay the price. I drove to Seattle in a state of controlled terror, my mind racing with possibilities and scenarios. Who were these people? How had they found my children so quickly? What kind of operation was I caught up in? The delivery went exactly as planned. A different set of men met me at the research facility, and they unloaded the cargo with the same careful precision that had been used in Atlanta. They inspected every container, noted the few that I had opened, and made check marks on their clipboards. Thank you for your cooperation, Miss Williams. one of them said as I prepared to leave. Your discretion in this matter is appreciated. You will find a performance bonus has been added to your payment. And that was it. I drove home to my base in Oklahoma, collected my pay, and tried to pretend that the whole thing had been a nightmare. But I knew it was not over. People who transport human remains without permits, people who threaten families to ensure silence, do not just disappear after one successful transaction. 6 months later, I received another call from the same dispatcher. Same pickup location, same destination, same cargo description. When I declined the load, citing equipment problems, my truck started having mysterious mechanical failures. Brakes that would not hold, tires that developed slow leaks, electrical systems that malfunctioned at dangerous moments. I got the message. I took the next load, and the one after that, and the one after that. Each time, I transported more human remains across the country, each time wondering who these people had been and how they had died. I am still driving those loads today. I do not have a choice. The alternative is too terrible to contemplate. But I want people to know that there are things moving on America's highways that should not exist. Cargo that represents the darkest side of human nature. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing in your trailer is not what the shipping papers say it is. The CB radio went dead quiet at 2:47 a.m., and that is when I knew something was terribly wrong. In 31 years of driving these highways, I have learned that truckers never stop talking on the radio, especially during the long, lonely hours before dawn. We tell jokes, share road conditions, warn each other about speed traps and way stations. The CB chatter is our lifeline, our connection to humanity when we are alone in the dark with nothing but miles of empty asphalt stretching ahead of us. But that night, as I was driving eastbound on Interstate 94 through the desolate stretch of Montana between Billings and Miles City, the radio fell completely silent. Not just quiet, but dead silent. Like every trucker within a 100-mile radius had suddenly vanished or stopped breathing. My name is James Mitchell, and I have been hauling freight across the northern states since I was 22 years old. I drive a 2017 Kenworth T680 with a sleeper cab, pulling whatever loads my dispatcher can find. Grain from North Dakota, lumber from Minnesota, manufactured goods from Chicago back to the West Coast. It is not glamorous work, but it pays the bills and gives me the freedom to be my own boss on the road. That particular run started in Fargo, North Dakota, where I had picked up a load of agricultural equipment bound for a farming cooperative in Spokane, Washington. Heavy machinery, combines and tractors, nothing unusual or particularly valuable. The kind of load that insurance companies do not worry about and cargo thieves usually ignore. The weather was typical for late October in Montana. Clear skies, no precipitation, but cold enough that I could see my breath when I stepped out of the cab. The forecast called for possible fog later in the night as the temperature dropped, but nothing that would slow down an experienced driver. I had been on the road for about 6 hours when I stopped for fuel and a meal at a truck stop outside Billings. The place was busy, probably 15 or 20 other trucks parked in the lot. Drivers grabbing showers, catching up on sleep, or just stretching their legs before continuing their runs. Normal truck stop atmosphere, familiar faces, and friendly conversations. That was where I first heard mention of the Phantom Convoy. I was sitting at the counter in the restaurant, working on a plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, when an older driver at the next stool started talking to the waitress about something strange he had seen the night before. "Damnedest thing I ever witnessed," he was saying, shaking his head as he stirred sugar into his coffee. I was running eastbound on this same stretch of 94, maybe 2 in the morning, when I saw them in my mirrors. 3 trucks running together, no lights except their running lights, keeping perfect formation about a quarter mile behind me. The waitress, a woman in her 50s, who had probably heard every trucker story ever told, raised an eyebrow. No headlights. How? Were they seeing the road? That is the thing, the driver continued. It was clear as day, full moon, but still. You do not run dark like that unless you're up to something illegal. So I got on the CB, tried to raise them, see what their story was. Nothing. Dead silence, like they were not even there. Maybe they had their radios turned off, the waitress suggested. The driver shook his head. No, that is not the weird part. The weird part is, when I slowed down to let them pass, they slowed down too. When I sped up, they matched my speed exactly, always staying that same distance behind me, like they were tethered to my truck somehow. He took a long sip of his coffee before continuing. Finally, I pulled off at a rest area, figured I would get a look at them when they passed. But they never did. I sat there for 20 minutes, watched the highway, and never saw those 3 trucks go by. It was like they just disappeared into thin air. I listened to this story with the kind of polite skepticism that experienced drivers develop over the years. Every truck stop has its share of tall tales and urban legends, stories that grow more elaborate with each telling. Phantom hitchhikers, mysterious lights in the sky, trucks that appear and disappear without explanation. Most of it is just loneliness and fatigue playing tricks on tired minds. But something about the way this old driver told his story, the genuine confusion and uneasiness in his voice, made me pay attention. He was not trying to entertain anyone or impress the waitress. He was genuinely troubled by what he had experienced. I finished my meal, topped off my fuel tank, and got back on the road around midnight. The highway was largely empty, which was normal for that time of night on that particular stretch. Most of the long-haul traffic ran during daylight hours when visibility was better and services were available. The few trucks I encountered were spaced far apart, brief glimpses of red taillights or white headlights in the distance. For the first hour, everything was normal. My CB radio crackled with the usual late-night chatter. Drivers checking in with each other, sharing information about road conditions, complaining about dispatchers and customers. The familiar background noise of the trucking community going about its business. That was when the fog started rolling in. At first, it was just wisps of vapor rising from the valleys and low-lying areas along the highway. But within 30 minutes, it had thickened into a dense blanket that reduced visibility to maybe 50 yards. I slowed down to 45 miles per hour and turned on my fog lights. But the golden beams seemed to be swallowed up by the gray-white wall surrounding my truck. Fog is dangerous for truckers. It conceals obstacles, makes it impossible to judge distances accurately, and can turn a routine drive into a white-knuckle experience. But I had driven through worse conditions before, and I was confident in my ability to handle it safely. That was when the CB radio went silent. Not gradually, like drivers signing off one by one as they reached their destinations. All at once, like someone had thrown a switch and cut off every transmission within range. I tried keying my microphone, calling out on channel 19, but got no response. I switched to other channels, tried the emergency frequency, even attempted to raise the local base stations. Nothing but static. I was checking my radio connections when I saw them in my mirrors. 3 trucks, running in perfect formation about a quarter mile behind me, just like the old driver had described. Even through the fog, I could make out their shapes. They appeared to be conventional tractors pulling standard trailers, but something about their silhouettes looked wrong. Too angular, too sharp, like they had been drawn by someone who had never actually seen a truck before. And they were running completely dark, No headlights, no marker lights, no identification numbers or company logos visible on their sides. Just dark shapes moving through the fog at exactly the same speed I was traveling, maintaining that precise distance behind me, no matter how I varied my speed. I tried the CB radio again. Breaker 19, this is eastbound Kenworth mile marker 126 on I-94. I have 3 trucks following me with no lights. Please identify yourselves. Silence. I slowed down to 35 miles per hour, expecting them to pass me or at least close the distance. Instead, they slowed down too, maintaining that same quarter-mile gap. I sped up to 55, pushing the safe limits for the fog conditions. They matched my speed exactly. For the next 20 miles, this bizarre procession continued. Me in front, struggling to see the road through the thickening fog, and 3 phantom trucks behind me, somehow navigating without any visible means of illumination. Every few minutes, I would try the CB radio again, hoping to reach someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. But the airwaves remained dead. That was when I started noticing other details that made my skin crawl. The trucks behind me were not leaving tire tracks in the thin layer of moisture that had accumulated on the asphalt. I could see my own tracks clearly in my side mirrors, dark lines following the path of my tires. But behind them, the road surface looked undisturbed, as if the 3 trucks were floating just above the pavement. More unsettling, they cast no shadows. Even in the fog, with my running lights and reflectors creating pools of illumination, objects cast shadows. But these trucks seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Dark voids moving through the gray landscape like holes cut out of reality itself. I was beginning to seriously question my sanity when I saw the exit sign for a rest area 5 miles ahead. I decided to pull off and see what would happen. If these were real trucks with real drivers, they would have to either pass me or follow me into the rest area. If they were some kind of hallucination brought on by fatigue and stress, stopping for a break might clear my head. I took the exit slowly, watching my mirrors constantly. The 3 trucks followed me down the off-ramp, maintaining their formation and distance. But as I pulled into the rest area parking lot, something impossible happened. They kept going, not past the rest area on the highway, but straight through it. I watched in my mirrors as all 3 trucks drove directly through the parking lot, through the building, through the trees on the far side, and disappeared into the fog beyond. No change in speed, no deviation from their path, just a smooth, uninterrupted journey through solid objects as if they were not there. I sat in my truck for almost an hour, engine running, heater on full blast, trying to process what I had just witnessed. Every rational part of my mind insisted that I had imagined it, that the fog and isolation had played tricks on my perception. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew it was not normal. When I finally got back on the highway, the fog was beginning to lift, and the CB radio crackled back to life. Drivers were checking in, reporting their positions, resuming the normal chatter that had been absent for the past 2 hours. I tried several times to tell other drivers what I had experienced, but every time I keyed the microphone, the words stuck in my throat. Who would believe such a story? Hell, I was not sure I believed it myself. I completed my run to Spokane without any further incidents, delivered the agricultural equipment on schedule, and tried to put the whole experience behind me. But over the next few weeks, I started hearing similar stories from other drivers. Always the same details. 3 trucks running dark, perfect formation, following other vehicles through remote stretches of highway, then disappearing without explanation. The stories were always from the same general area, that desolate stretch of Montana between Billings and the North Dakota border. And they were always during fog conditions, always in the early morning hours, always when the CB radio went mysteriously silent. I started avoiding that route when possible, taking longer paths through Wyoming or South Dakota to reach my destinations. But the trucking industry is small, and sometimes you do not have a choice about which roads you take. 3 months later, I found myself on that same stretch of I-94, hauling a load of electronics from Minneapolis to Seattle. It was a clear night, no fog, and I was feeling confident that whatever I had experienced before was a one-time occurrence. The CB radio was active with normal traffic, and I was making good time. But at exactly 2:47 a.m., the radio went silent again. I looked in my mirrors and saw them immediately. 3 trucks, running dark, maintaining that perfect quarter-mile distance. This time, there was no fog to blame, no atmospheric conditions to explain away what I was seeing. Just 3 impossible vehicles following me through the Montana darkness. But now, I understood something that I had missed during my first encounter. These were not living drivers playing some elaborate prank or engaging in illegal activity. These were the ghosts of truckers who had died on this stretch of highway, condemned to drive the same route for eternity. I have researched the accident records for that area, and the statistics are sobering. Over the past 30 years, dozens of truckers have been killed in crashes along that section of I-94. Jackknifed semis, rollovers, collisions with wildlife, mechanical failures that led to fatal accidents. Many of the victims were driving in convoys, following each other too closely through dangerous conditions. Now they continue their journey. 3 drivers who died together and refused to rest. They follow the living, perhaps trying to warn us of the dangers ahead, or perhaps simply unable to break free from the route that claimed their lives. I still see them sometimes, on clear nights when the highway is empty and the CB radio falls silent. 3 phantom trucks in my mirrors, forever following, forever traveling a road that leads nowhere but deeper into the darkness. And every time I see them, I remember that the highway is more than just asphalt and steel. It is a repository of memories, a graveyard of dreams, and sometimes a prison for the dead who cannot let go. The road never forgets, and neither do those who died on it. After 30 years on the road, you develop a 6th sense about people. You learn to read body language, to spot trouble before it spots you, to trust your instincts when something feels wrong. That ability has saved my life more times than I can count, but it failed me completely at a truck stop outside Montgomery, Alabama, on a humid night in July that I will never forget. My name is Anthony Kowalski, but everyone calls me Tony. I have been driving long-haul routes across the southeastern states since I was 23 years old. Back when CB radios were the only way to communicate with other drivers, and truck stops were small family-owned operations that knew every regular customer by name. I drive a 2019 Peterbilt 389 with a custom paint job that cost me more than some people make in a year. Midnight black with silver pinstripes, chrome exhaust stacks that shine like mirrors, and enough LED lights to illuminate a football stadium. Some people think it is too flashy, but after 3 decades of living on the road, my truck is the only home I have ever really known. That particular run started in Jacksonville, Florida, where I had picked up a load of paper products bound for a distribution center in Nashville, Tennessee. It was routine cargo, nothing valuable enough to attract cargo thieves, and the route was one I had driven probably 50 times over the years. Familiar truck stops, predictable traffic patterns, no surprises expected. I had been driving for about 8 hours when I stopped for fuel at the Dixie Travel Plaza, a mid-sized truck stop about 30 miles south of Montgomery. The place had been there for at least 15 years, and I had stopped there dozens of times before. Clean restrooms, decent food, and a repair shop that could handle most mechanical problems. The kind of establishment that long-haul drivers depend on. The fuel islands were busy, which was normal for that time of evening. Drivers were topping off their tanks, grabbing showers, and settling in for mandatory rest periods. I pulled up to pump number 7 and started the refueling process, a routine I had performed thousands of times before. That was when I met Eddie. He appeared beside my truck while I was cleaning my windshield, a thin man in his 40s wearing greasy coveralls and a friendly smile. He had the kind of face that blended into crowds, unremarkable except for his eyes, which seemed to take in every detail of my truck and equipment. "Nice rig," he said, running his hand along the polished chrome bumper. "Peterbilt 389, right? These are beautiful machines when they are maintained properly." I nodded, continuing to work on the windshield. Small talk from other truckers was normal at fuel stops, part of the informal community that existed among drivers. But something about Eddie made me uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way his eyes lingered on the expensive chrome accessories, calculating their value. Maybe it was how he stood just a little too close, invading my personal space in a way that experienced drivers usually avoided. "You haul this route regular?" he asked, leaning against the fuel pump. "I work in the repair shop here, and I swear I have seen this truck before." "Yeah, I come through here every few weeks," I replied, finishing the windshield and moving to check my tire pressure. "Good stop. Never had any problems." Eddie smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "That is what we like to hear. Customer satisfaction is our top priority." He paused, seeming to study my face. "You know, I was just thinking. That front tire looks a little low to me. Maybe you should bring the truck around to the shop. Let me take a proper look. No charge for the inspection." I glanced at the tire he was indicating. It looked fine to me, holding pressure normally with no visible wear or damage. But Eddie was the professional mechanic, and tire problems could be dangerous at highway speeds. Against my better judgment, I agreed to let him take a look. "Great," he said, his smile widening. "Just pull around to bay number 3. I will meet you there in a few minutes." I finished fueling, paid for the diesel, and drove around to the repair shop. Bay number 3 was at the far end of the building, separated from the main truck stop by a row of empty trailers and construction equipment. The area was poorly lit, with only a few security lights casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. Eddie was waiting for me, along with another man I had not seen before. This second man was larger, built like a linebacker, with arms covered in tattoos and the kind of dead eyes that I had learned to associate with serious trouble. He was holding what looked like a heavy wrench, but the way he gripped it suggested it was not intended for mechanical work. "Just pull right up here," Eddie called out, waving me forward. "We will have you back on the road in no time." Every alarm bell in my head started going off at once. The isolated location, the second man with the weapon, the overly friendly mechanic who had been asking too many questions about my route and schedule. This was not a tire inspection. This was a setup. I stopped the truck about 20 feet from the bay and set the air brakes, but I kept the engine running. "Actually," I called through the driver's side window, "the tire looks fine to me now. I think I will just head on down the road." Eddie's friendly mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. "Come on, friend. You're already here? Let me at least take a quick look." Professional courtesy. The big man with the wrench had moved to block the exit from the bay area. He was not being subtle about it, just standing there with his arms crossed, making it clear that I was not going anywhere until they were finished with whatever they had planned. But 30 years of driving had taught me more than just how to handle an 18-wheeler. I had learned to think fast under pressure, to assess situations quickly, and to take decisive action when my life was on the line. Instead of getting out of the truck like they expected, I released the air brakes and floored the accelerator. The big Caterpillar engine roared to life, and 40 tons of truck and trailer lurched forward toward the exit. The big man dove out of the way just in time to avoid being crushed, rolling across the asphalt and shouting curses. Eddie was screaming something behind me, but I could not make out the words over the sound of the engine. I did not care what he was saying. I just wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and that truck stop. I made it about 5 miles down the highway before I pulled over and called the police. When I explained what had happened, the dispatcher told me that they had been investigating a string of attacks on truck drivers in that area. Drivers who had stopped for fuel or repairs and then disappeared. Their trucks found days later, stripped of cargo and expensive accessories. "You are lucky you trusted your instincts," the detective who interviewed me later said. Eddie Morrison has been running that operation for at least 2 years. We think he and his partner have killed at least 6 drivers, maybe more. 6 drivers. 6 men who had just been trying to do their jobs, to earn a living on the road, and they had walked into a trap disguised as friendly assistants. The thought made me sick to my stomach. The investigation revealed that Eddie had been working at the truck stop legitimately for several months, establishing a cover identity and identifying potential victims. He would target drivers with expensive trucks or valuable cargo, lure them to the isolated repair bay, and then he and his partner would rob and kill them. The bodies were disposed of in a remote swamp about 50 miles away, while the trucks were taken to a chop shop and stripped for parts. Eddie Morrison was eventually sentenced to death for his crimes. His partner, a man named Dale Hutchins, received life in prison without the possibility of parole. The truck stop was sold to new owners who completely renovated the facility and hired an entirely new staff. But the damage was done. Every time I pull into a truck stop now, I remember Eddie's friendly smile and calculating eyes. I remember how close I came to becoming just another statistic, another driver who trusted the wrong person at the wrong time. The highway is full of predators who know exactly how to exploit the trust that exists in the trucking community. They know that drivers are more likely to help each other, to accept offers of assistance from people wearing mechanics' coveralls or truck stop uniforms. They weaponize our professional courtesy and use it against us. I still stop at truck stops, of course. I have to. But I am more careful now, more suspicious of unsolicited offers to help, more aware of my surroundings when I am in isolated areas. The paranoia is exhausting, but it is the price of survival on America's highways. Eddie Morrison taught me that the most dangerous predators are not the ones who look threatening. They are the ones who look helpful, who offer exactly what you need at exactly the right moment. They are the ones who smile while they are planning to kill you. The road is a dangerous place, and sometimes the people who claim to want to help you are the ones you should fear the most. The dispatcher's voice was different that night. Too calm for a rush delivery, too smooth for someone calling in a favor at 3 in the morning. After 28 years of hauling loads across the western states, I should have recognized the warning signs. I should have asked more questions. But the money was too good, and I needed every dollar I could get to keep my rig running. My name is Samuel Washington, but everyone calls me Sam. I have been driving big rigs since I was 24 years old. working my way up from company driver to owner-operator to running my own small fleet. These days, I drive a 2021 Freightliner Cascadia with a custom sleeper berth that serves as my home more often than the apartment I rent in Oakland. The call came in at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in September. I was parked at a truck stop outside Bakersfield, catching up on my mandatory rest hours between loads, when my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. "Mr. Washington, this is dispatch for Meridian Logistics. We have an urgent load that needs to move tonight. Are you available for immediate pickup?" Meridian Logistics was a company I had never heard of, but that was not unusual in the trucking industry. Freight brokers and logistics companies appeared and disappeared constantly, and most legitimate drivers worked with dozens of different companies over the course of a year. "What kind of load?" I asked, sitting up in my sleeper berth and reaching for my logbook. "And what's the rate?" "Specialized cargo, temperature controlled. Pickup in Riverside with delivery to a research facility outside Las Vegas. The rate is $8,000 for a same-day delivery." $8,000 for a 400-mile run was more than double the normal rate for that route. In trucking, when someone offers that kind of money for a routine haul, there is usually something wrong with the cargo, the customer, or the situation. But I had truck payments due and my insurance premium was coming up, so I agreed to take the load. "Great," the dispatcher said. "The pickup address is 1247 Industrial Boulevard in Riverside. Ask for Mr. Chen at the loading dock. He will have all the paperwork ready." The address led me to an unmarked warehouse in an industrial district that looked like it had seen better days. No company signs, no loading dock numbers, just a plain metal building surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. The kind of place that processed cargo but did not want anyone to know what kind. Mr. Chen was waiting for me at the loading dock, along with two other men in matching gray coveralls. They moved with military precision, checking my identification, inspecting my trailer, and supervising the loading process with an attention to detail that seemed excessive for whatever I was hauling. The cargo consisted of 12 large containers, each about the size of a refrigerator, marked only with alphanumeric codes and biohazard symbols. They were sealed with what looked like military-grade locks and connected to a sophisticated temperature control system that maintained a steady 38 degrees Fahrenheit. "What exactly am I hauling?" I asked Mr. Chen as we completed the paperwork. "Biological specimens," he replied without looking up from his clipboard. "Medical research materials that need to reach the destination facility within 18 hours. The temperature must remain constant, and the containers cannot be opened under any circumstances." I had hauled biological specimens before, everything from laboratory animals to human organs for transplant. It was specialized work that paid well, but it required careful handling and strict adherence to transportation protocols. Nothing about this load seemed unusual, except for the secrecy and the urgency. The delivery address was equally anonymous. A coordinates location in the Nevada desert, about 50 miles northwest of Las Vegas. No street address, no facility name, just GPS coordinates that led to what appeared to be an abandoned military installation. I made good time through the night, following Interstate 15 through the Mojave Desert, while the temperature control system hummed quietly behind me. The containers remained stable, the locks intact, and the monitoring equipment showed no problems with the cargo. It was not until I reached the delivery location that I realized something was seriously wrong. The GPS coordinates led me to a heavily guarded compound surrounded by high fences and security towers. Armed guards checked my identification and directed me to a loading dock inside the perimeter. But what I saw there made my blood run cold. The facility was not a research laboratory or medical center. It was some kind of processing plant, with industrial equipment that looked designed for manufacturing rather than scientific research. And the people working there were not wearing lab coats or medical scrubs. They were wearing robes, long dark robes with symbols embroidered on the chest, moving between the machinery with ritualistic precision. Some were chanting in a language I did not recognize, while others arranged objects on what looked like altars positioned throughout the facility. I wanted to turn around and leave, but armed guards had positioned themselves around my truck, making it clear that departure was not an option. The unloading process began immediately, with robed figures carefully removing each container from my trailer and carrying it to different stations within the facility. That was when I saw what they were doing with the cargo. The containers held human organs, but not the kind used for medical transplants. These were prepared for some other purpose, arranged on metal tables surrounded by candles and ritual implements. The robed figures were performing some kind of ceremony over each organ, chanting and making gestures that looked more like worship than science. I had stumbled into the middle of something that went far beyond illegal organ trafficking. This was a cult that used human body parts for ritualistic purposes, and they had been using my truck to transport their materials without my knowledge. "Mr. Washington," a voice said behind me. I turned to see a tall man in an elaborate robe approaching, flanked by 2 guards. "Thank you for your service to our organization. Your discretion in this matter is essential." "I want to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I delivered your cargo. Now I want to go." The robed man smiled, but it was not a reassuring expression. "I am afraid that is not possible. You have seen too much of our operation to simply walk away. But we have a proposition for you." He gestured toward the loading dock, where I could see other trucks parked in the shadows. "We have need of reliable drivers who can transport our materials without asking uncomfortable questions. The compensation is generous and the work is steady. What if I refuse?" His smile faded. "Then you will become part of our research program. Your organs are in excellent condition for someone your age." The threat was clear. Join their operation or become their next victim. I looked around the facility, counting guards and exit routes, trying to calculate my chances of escape. But there were too many armed men, too many obstacles between me and freedom. "What exactly would I be hauling?" I asked, buying time while I considered my options. "Biological materials, as tonight. Sometimes from hospitals and morgues that cooperate with our research, sometimes from more informal sources. The origin of the specimens is not your concern. Your job is simply transportation." He was describing a network of organ theft and ritual murder that stretched across multiple states, using legitimate trucking companies and unwitting drivers to move their materials. And now they wanted me to become a willing participant in their operation. That was when I made the decision that probably saved my life. Instead of refusing outright or trying to argue, I pretended to consider their offer seriously. "The money would have to be substantial," I said, "and I would need guarantees about my safety and the safety of my equipment." The robed man nodded approvingly. "Of course. We are reasonable people, Mr. Washington. We understand that this arrangement must be mutually beneficial." Over the next hour, he outlined the details of their operation, while I memorized every piece of information I could gather. Names, locations, schedules, the scope of their activities. They had corrupted employees at hospitals and medical facilities across 6 states, stealing organs and bodies that were supposed to be cremated or buried. The ritual purpose of these materials was something I did not want to understand, but it clearly involved human sacrifice on a scale that defied comprehension. When they finally released me with instructions to await their next call, I drove straight to the nearest FBI field office and reported everything I had witnessed. The investigation that followed lasted 18 months and resulted in the arrest of over 60 people involved in what prosecutors called the largest ritual murder conspiracy in American history. The facility in Nevada was raided 3 days after my report, but the leaders of the cult had already disappeared. Some of the lower-level participants were convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but the core organizers were never found. I learned later that they had been using dozens of drivers like me, truckers who thought they were hauling legitimate medical cargo, but were actually transporting materials for ritual murder. Most of the other drivers never discovered the truth about their loads, but a few who asked too many questions or witnessed too much simply disappeared. The trucking company that had originally hired me, Meridian Logistics, turned out to be a front operation run by the cult to recruit unwitting drivers. The real dispatcher I had spoken to was one of their members, using a fake identity and stolen credentials to access the freight networks that legitimate truckers depend on. I still drive the highways of the American West, but I am much more careful about the loads I accept and the companies I work with. I verify credentials, research unfamiliar clients, and trust my instincts when something feels wrong. The money is never worth your life, and the cargo is never worth your soul. Sometimes the most dangerous freight is the kind you never suspect, delivered to places that should not exist, for purposes that defy human decency. The highway connects more than just cities and states. Sometimes it connects the living world to something much darker.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we return with another collection of disturbing accounts that have been carefully documented and preserved from the darkest corners of Oregon. In this episode, we will journey through 6 harrowing tales of human encounters with forces that defy explanation. Each story drawn from real testimonies of individuals who survived experiences that forever changed their understanding of what lurks in the shadows of the Pacific Northwest. From Forest Service rangers to coastal patrol officers, from urban explorers to farm workers, these witnesses have come forward to share their most terrifying encounters with phenomena that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. Each narrative has been meticulously researched and reconstructed from detailed accounts provided by those who lived through these events. To protect the privacy and safety of those involved, certain names and identifying details have been carefully altered while preserving the essential truth of their experiences. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for daily collections of true horror content that will challenge everything you thought you knew about our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the next buried truth. Let us know in the comments below which Oregon location you would never visit alone after hearing these stories. After 15 years working for the Oregon Forest Service, I thought I had seen everything these woods could throw at me. I was wrong, and what happened last October in the Deschutes National Forest ended my career. My name is Joshua, and I used to patrol the backcountry areas where most people never venture. It was my job to monitor trail conditions, check for illegal camping, and ensure hikers stayed safe in some of the most remote wilderness Oregon has to offer. I loved that job more than anything in my life, which makes what I am about to tell you that much harder to accept. The incident happened during what should have been a routine patrol of the Three Sisters Wilderness area. I had been assigned to check a section of trail that had been closed to the public for 3 months due to reported landslide damage. The area was about 12 miles from the nearest road, accessible only on foot through dense pine and fir forest that stretched for miles in every direction. I had hiked this particular section dozens of times over the years, and I knew every landmark, every stream crossing, and every potential hazard along the way. That morning started like any other. I loaded my pack with the usual gear, emergency supplies, radio equipment, and my service weapon. The weather forecast called for clear skies and moderate temperatures, perfect conditions for a long day hike into the wilderness. I signed out at the ranger station at 6:30 in the morning and began the trek to the closed trail section. The first few hours passed without incident as I made my way along familiar paths, documenting trail conditions and taking photographs of areas that would need maintenance attention. The trouble started around 11 in the morning when I reached the section that had reportedly suffered landslide damage. According to the incident report filed 3 months earlier, a massive rock slide had completely blocked the trail, making it impassable for hikers. But when I arrived at the coordinates listed in the report, I found the trail completely clear. There was no evidence of any rock slide, no debris, no damaged trees, nothing that would suggest any kind of geological event had occurred in the area. The trail looked exactly as it had during my last patrol 6 months earlier. I spent nearly an hour examining the area, taking photographs and measurements to document what I was seeing. According to my GPS unit, I was definitely in the right location. The coordinates matched perfectly with those listed in the incident report, but there was absolutely no sign of the landslide that had supposedly closed this section of trail. I radioed back to the ranger station to report my findings, but I could not get through. The radio crackled with static, which was unusual given that I had tested the equipment that morning and confirmed it was working properly. I decided to continue along the trail to see if perhaps the landslide had occurred further ahead than originally reported. The path wound through increasingly dense forest with towering Douglas firs creating a thick canopy overhead. The undergrowth was heavy with ferns and moss, and the air carried that distinctive smell of decomposing pine needles and damp earth that you only find deep in old-growth forests. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even, until I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The forest had gone completely silent. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no buzzing of insects. The only sound was my own breathing and the soft crunch of pine needles under my boots. In 15 years of working in these woods, I had never experienced such complete and unnatural silence. Every instinct I had developed during my career was telling me that something was very wrong. I stood motionless for several minutes, listening carefully for any sound that might explain the eerie quiet that had settled over the forest. That was when I first heard it. A low humming sound that seemed to come from somewhere ahead of me on the trail. It was barely audible at first, more of a vibration that I felt in my chest than an actual sound. But as I stood there listening, it gradually grew louder and more distinct. The humming had an almost mechanical quality to it, like the sound of distant machinery or electrical equipment. But there were no power lines in this area, no buildings, no roads, nothing that could produce such a sound. I pulled out my GPS unit to confirm my location and verify that I had not somehow wandered off course. The display showed that I was still following the designated trail, miles from any human development. I decided to investigate the source of the humming sound, moving carefully along the trail with all my senses on high alert. The sound grew gradually louder as I advanced, and I began to notice other unusual signs. The trees along the trail appeared to be dying, their needles brown and brittle despite the fact that it was still early fall. The undergrowth was sparse and sickly looking, as if something had drained all the life from the forest floor. After walking for another 10 minutes, I came to a small clearing that I had never seen before, despite having hiked this trail numerous times over the years. The clearing was perfectly circular, about 50 feet in diameter and completely devoid of vegetation. The ground was bare dirt, packed hard like concrete with strange geometric patterns etched into the surface. The humming sound was much louder here, and I could feel it resonating through the soles of my boots. At the center of the clearing stood what I can only describe as some kind of structure, though it defied any conventional architectural description. It appeared to be made of a dark, metallic material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The structure was roughly cylindrical, about 8 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter, with no visible seams, joints, or openings. The surface was covered with the same geometric patterns that were etched into the ground, and the entire thing seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly energy. I approached the structure cautiously, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn around and leave immediately. But my training and professional curiosity compelled me to investigate further. I needed to document what I was seeing, to gather evidence that could be analyzed and explained by people with more expertise than I possessed. I pulled out my camera and began taking photographs from multiple angles, making sure to capture both the structure itself and the strange patterns carved into the clearing floor. As I moved around the structure taking pictures, I noticed that my compass was spinning wildly, unable to settle on any consistent direction. My GPS unit had stopped working entirely, displaying only error messages when I tried to determine my location. Even more disturbing, my watch had stopped, the hands frozen at exactly 11:47, though I was certain it had been working properly when I checked it earlier. The humming sound began to change, becoming more complex and varied, almost like some kind of alien language or communication system. I could feel the vibrations growing stronger, penetrating deep into my body and making my bones ache. The air around the structure began to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Though the temperature felt normal, that was when I saw them. At first, they were just shadows moving at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in my peripheral vision. But as I focused my attention on them, the shadows became more distinct, more solid. They were humanoid in shape, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with movements that seemed to flow rather than walk. Their faces, if they could be called faces, were featureless and dark, like voids in the shape of human heads. There were 3 of them that I could see clearly, though I had the sense that more were present just beyond the tree line. They moved with purpose, circling the clearing in a pattern that seemed to mirror the geometric designs carved into the ground. They paid no attention to me at first, as if I were invisible or irrelevant to whatever they were doing. I continued taking photographs, though my hands were shaking so badly that I was not sure any of the images would be usable. Part of me wanted to run to get as far away from that clearing as possible. But another part, the professional part that had served me well during my career, insisted that I needed to document everything I was witnessing. This was beyond anything in my training or experience, but it was real, and it was happening in a forest that was under my protection. One of the shadow figures suddenly stopped moving and turned in my direction. Even though it had no visible eyes or facial features, I could feel its attention focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It raised what might have been an arm and pointed directly at me. The humming sound changed again, becoming sharper and more urgent, almost threatening in its tone. The other figures stopped their circling and also turned toward me. I felt a wave of something, not heat or cold, but some other form of energy that made every nerve in my body scream in alarm. My camera stopped working, the display going dark despite a full battery. My radio, which had been producing only static, went completely dead. Even the digital display on my GPS unit flickered and went blank. I knew that I had to leave immediately. Every survival instinct I possessed was telling me that I was in mortal danger. I backed slowly toward the tree line, never taking my eyes off the shadow figures. They did not follow me, but I could feel their attention tracking my every movement. The humming sound grew louder and more aggressive, as if warning me never to return. Once I reached the safety of the forest, I turned and ran. I ran harder and faster than I had ever run in my life, crashing through undergrowth and leaping over fallen logs in my desperate need to put distance between myself and that clearing. I did not stop running until I reached my vehicle, and even then I could still feel the phantom vibrations of that alien humming in my bones. The drive back to the ranger station was a blur of conflicting emotions and racing thoughts. How could I possibly report what I had witnessed? Who would believe such an impossible story? But I had to try. I had a professional and moral obligation to document the incident and ensure that other people did not stumble into whatever was lurking in that clearing. When I arrived at the station, I immediately went to my supervisor and requested a private meeting. I told him everything, describing the clearing, the structure, and the shadow figures in as much detail as I could remember. He listened patiently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but his expression grew increasingly skeptical as my story progressed. When I finished my account, he asked to see the photographs I had taken. I handed over my camera, but when we reviewed the images, they showed nothing but normal forest scenes. The clearing was not visible in any of the pictures, nor was the strange structure or the shadow figures. According to the camera, I had spent the day hiking through perfectly ordinary woodland. My supervisor suggested that I might be suffering from altitude sickness or dehydration, both of which could cause hallucinations and disorientation. He recommended that I take a few days off to rest and recover, and then we would discuss the incident further. But I knew what I had seen was real despite the lack of photographic evidence. Over the next several days, I tried to convince myself that maybe my supervisor was right. Maybe I had experienced some kind of medical episode that caused me to hallucinate the entire incident. But deep down, I knew that was not the case. The memory of that clearing was too vivid, too detailed, too consistent to be dismissed as a hallucination. I requested permission to return to the area with a partner, but my supervisor denied the request. He cited safety concerns and suggested that I focus on less remote assignments until I had fully recovered from whatever had affected me during the patrol. But I could see in his eyes that he thought I was losing my grip on reality. The final straw came 3 weeks later when I tried to access the incident report that had originally sent me to investigate the landslide. According to the filing system, no such report existed. There was no record of any landslide in that area, no closure order for the trail, and no assignment for me to investigate. According to the official records, I had never been sent to that section of the Deschutes National Forest. When I confronted my supervisor about the missing paperwork, he became defensive and suggested that I might be confusing details from different assignments. He implied that my mental state was deteriorating and that perhaps it was time for me to consider early retirement. The message was clear: stop pursuing this matter or face the consequences. I realized that whatever was happening in that clearing was being covered up at levels far above my pay grade. Someone or something did not want that area investigated or documented. My choice was simple: stay quiet and keep my job, or continue asking questions and face termination. I chose to resign. I could not continue working for an organization that would hide something so significant from the public. People had a right to know about the dangers lurking in our national forests, even if those dangers defied conventional explanation. That was 6 months ago. I have not returned to the Deschutes National Forest since then, and I have no intention of ever going back. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my house, I swear I can still hear that alien humming sound calling to me from the depths of the Oregon wilderness. I know most people will not believe my story, just as my former supervisor did not believe it. But I also know that what I experienced in that clearing was real, regardless of what the official records might say. There are things in our forests that we do not understand, things that someone in authority has decided we are better off not knowing about. All I can do now is warn others to be careful when venturing into remote wilderness areas. Stay on marked trails, travel with partners, and trust your instincts if something feels wrong. The forest may look peaceful and welcoming, but there are places where the normal rules of reality do not apply. And those places are far more dangerous than any wild animal you might encounter. If you ever find yourself in a clearing where no birds sing and no insects buzz, where strange structures rise from geometric patterns carved into lifeless earth, do not investigate, do not take photographs, do not try to understand what you are seeing. Just run and never look back. I have been doing Oregon Trail reenactments for 8 years, always trying to make the experience as authentic as possible. But during our 2024 journey near Baker City, we discovered that some parts of history should never be relived. My name is Olivia, and what I am about to tell you is why I will never participate in another historical reenactment as long as I live. For those who do not know what Oregon Trail reenactments involve, we are a group of history enthusiasts who spend weeks each summer recreating the journey that pioneers made across the American West in the 1800s. We use authentic equipment, dress in period clothing, and follow the same routes that thousands of families traveled over 150 years ago. The goal is to gain a deeper understanding of the hardships and challenges faced by those brave souls who helped build this country. Our group consisted of 12 adults and 6 children ranging in age from 8 to 62. We had been planning this particular reenactment for 2 years, working with historians and local authorities to map out an authentic route through eastern Oregon that would take us along some of the lesser-known segments of the original Oregon Trail. The journey was scheduled to last 3 weeks, covering approximately 180 miles of challenging terrain. I had been elected as the wagon master for this expedition, which meant I was responsible for coordinating our daily movements, ensuring everyone stayed safe, and maintaining the historical accuracy of our experience. I took this role very seriously, spending months researching the specific challenges faced by pioneer families in this region during the 1840s and 1850s. Our preparation was extensive. We had authentic covered wagons pulled by oxen, period-appropriate clothing and tools, and historically accurate food supplies including hardtack, dried beans, and salted meat. We carried no modern conveniences except for emergency communication equipment and basic medical supplies, both of which were kept hidden from sight to maintain the illusion of authenticity. The first week of our journey went exactly as planned. The weather was favorable, our oxen were strong and healthy, and the group was in high spirits. We followed wagon ruts that were still visible after more than a century, camping each night in locations that had been used by actual pioneer families during their westward migration. The children in our group were especially excited, treating the entire experience like the ultimate educational adventure. But everything changed during our second week, when we reached a section of the trail near Baker City that none of us had ever traveled before. According to our historical maps, this area had been the site of several tragic incidents during the peak years of Oregon Trail migration. Families had been forced to abandon wagons and possessions when the terrain became too difficult to navigate. Some had died from disease, others from accidents, and a few had simply disappeared without explanation. The landscape in this region was harsh and unforgiving, with rocky terrain, steep hills, and very little water. The original pioneers had struggled mightily to cross this section, and we were beginning to understand why. Our oxen were having difficulty pulling the wagons over the rough ground, and we were forced to stop frequently to rest both the animals and ourselves. It was during one of these rest stops that we first noticed something unusual. While examining the ground around our campsite, one of our group members discovered what appeared to be remnants of an old wagon wheel, partially buried in the dirt and rocks. This was not uncommon along the Oregon Trail, as pioneers were often forced to abandon equipment that became too damaged or burdensome to continue carrying. But as we examined the wheel more closely, we realized it was in remarkably good condition for something that should have been over 150 years old. The wood showed signs of age and weathering, but it had not rotted or disintegrated the way we would have expected. More disturbing, there were dark stains on the wood that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Our group historian, a retired professor named Margaret, suggested that we might have discovered an artifact from one of the documented tragedies that had occurred in this area. She pulled out her research materials and confirmed that at least 3 separate wagon trains had reported serious incidents at this location, including accidents, illness, and attacks by hostile parties. That night, as we sat around our campfire eating our simple meal of beans and hardtack, Margaret shared some of the historical accounts she had uncovered during her research. The stories were darker than any of us had expected, involving not just the typical hardships of frontier life, but also violence, betrayal, and mysterious disappearances that had never been properly explained. One account from 1847 described a family of 7 who had stopped to rest in this exact area after their wagon broke down. When a search party found them 3 days later, the parents and oldest children were missing, and the 2 youngest children were found hiding in the wagon, too traumatized to speak. The children eventually told authorities that strange people had come in the night, people who looked like pioneers but acted wrong, moving and talking in ways that frightened them. Another story from 1852 involved a wagon train of 23 families who camped in this region for 2 nights while making repairs to their equipment. On the second night, several members of the group reported hearing voices calling to them from the darkness, voices that sounded like family members who were supposed to be sleeping in their wagons. When they investigated, they found their actual family members safe in their beds with no explanation for the voices they had heard. The most disturbing account came from 1856, when a group of 15 pioneers reported encountering what they described as a phantom wagon train. According to their testimony, they had seen another group of travelers moving parallel to their route, always staying just at the edge of visibility. When they attempted to make contact with these other pioneers, hoping to join forces for mutual protection, the phantom group would disappear entirely, only to reappear in a different location hours later. As Margaret shared these historical accounts, I noticed that several members of our group were becoming increasingly uncomfortable. The children especially seemed frightened by the stories, and I began to worry that our pursuit of historical authenticity might be having a negative impact on what was supposed to be an educational and enjoyable experience. But it was too late to change course. We were committed to following the historical route, and we were already 2 weeks into our journey with only 1 week remaining. We had invested too much time, money, and effort to abandon the expedition based on old stories and legends that probably had perfectly rational explanations. That night, I lay in my bedroll listening to the sounds of the wilderness around us. The wind through the sagebrush, the distant cry of coyotes, and the occasional snort or shifting movement of our oxen as they grazed nearby. But mixed in with these natural sounds, I began to hear something else. Voices, very faint and distant, that seemed to be coming from somewhere beyond our campsite. At first, I assumed it was other members of our group talking quietly around the dying embers of our campfire. But when I raised my head to look, I could see that everyone in our camp was asleep. The voices were coming from somewhere else, somewhere in the darkness beyond the circle of light cast by our fire. I listened carefully, trying to determine what the voices were saying and where exactly they were coming from. They seemed to be having a conversation, multiple people discussing something in urgent, hushed tones. But I could not make out the specific words, and the sound seemed to move around our campsite, coming first from one direction and then from another. I considered waking the others, but I did not want to cause unnecessary alarm over what might simply be travelers camped somewhere nearby. Instead, I lay quietly and continued to listen. hoping the voices would either stop or become clear enough for me to understand what was being said. After nearly an hour of listening to the mysterious conversation, I finally heard something that made my blood run cold. One of the voices clearly called out the name of Margaret, our group historian, not shouting her name as if trying to get her attention, but discussing her in the same hushed tone that had characterized the entire conversation. I sat up immediately, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and confusion. Someone was out there in the darkness talking about one of our group members by name. This was no coincidence, and it was certainly not a group of innocent travelers who happened to be camping nearby. I quietly made my way over to where Margaret was sleeping and gently shook her awake. When she opened her eyes, I put my finger to my lips and pointed toward the darkness where the voices were coming from. She sat up slowly, listening carefully, and after a few minutes she heard them too. We woke the other adults in our group one by one, being careful not to disturb the sleeping children. Soon we had 8 adults sitting quietly around the remains of our campfire, all listening to the mysterious voices that continued to drift through the darkness around us. The conversation seemed to be focused on our group specifically, discussing our movements, our equipment, and individual members by name. They knew details about our journey that no outsider should have known, including our planned route for the following day and the specific supplies we were carrying in our wagons. One of the men in our group, a retired military officer named Robert, suggested that we might be dealing with modern-day thieves who had been monitoring our expedition and were planning to rob us of our authentic historical equipment and supplies. Some of our wagons, oxen, and period artifacts were worth considerable money, and we were carrying everything in isolated wilderness areas where criminal activity would be difficult to detect or investigate. But as we continued to listen to the voices, it became clear that this was not a simple robbery scheme. The people talking about us were discussing our journey in ways that suggested they knew far more about the historical Oregon Trail than any ordinary criminals would know. They referenced specific events from the 1800s, mentioned families and individuals who had traveled this route over 150 years ago, and spoke about our reenactment as if it were somehow connected to those long-ago tragedies. Margaret grabbed her research materials and began looking through her historical accounts, comparing what the voices were saying to the documented incidents she had uncovered. The correlation was undeniable. The voices were referencing the same families, the same tragedies, and the same mysterious disappearances that had been reported in this area during the peak years of Oregon Trail migration. As dawn began to break, the voices gradually faded away, leaving us exhausted and deeply unsettled. We had spent the entire night listening to people discuss our expedition in detail, but we had never seen who was talking or determined where they were located. Despite searching the area around our campsite, we found no evidence that anyone else had been nearby during the night. We faced a difficult decision. We could continue with our planned route, hoping that the previous night had been an isolated incident, or we could abandon our carefully planned expedition and head for the nearest town. The rational part of me wanted to continue, to maintain the historical authenticity of our journey and complete what we had started. But the protective part of me was deeply concerned about the safety of the children in our group. The decision was made for us later that morning when we discovered that one of our wagons had been damaged during the night. The canvas top had been slashed in multiple places and several of our essential supplies had been stolen, including most of our remaining food and all of our medical supplies. Whoever had been talking about us in the darkness had also taken action against us. Robert conducted a thorough investigation of the crime scene, using his military training to look for clues about who might have been responsible for the theft and vandalism. What he found was more disturbing than the crime itself. The footprints around our damaged wagon were not from modern hiking boots or work shoes, but from what appeared to be authentic period footwear. the kind of leather boots and shoes that pioneers would have worn during the 1800s. More unsettling, the method used to slash our wagon canvas was not consistent with a modern knife or blade, but rather with the kind of rough, improvised cutting tools that would have been available to travelers on the original Oregon Trail. Someone was not just stealing from us, but doing so in a way that was historically authentic to the period we were trying to recreate. We had no choice but to abandon our expedition. With our food supplies stolen and our wagon damaged, we could not safely continue our journey, especially with children in our group. We loaded our remaining supplies into the undamaged wagons and began the difficult trek back toward the nearest town where we could get help and contact authorities about the theft. The return journey was tense and frightening. We moved as quickly as possible while constantly watching for signs that we were being followed or observed. Several times during that first day, members of our group reported seeing figures in the distance, people dressed in period clothing who seemed to be shadowing our movements but always staying just far enough away to avoid clear identification. On our final night before reaching town, we experienced the most terrifying incident of the entire expedition. As we set up camp in what we hoped would be a safe location near a well-traveled road, we began to hear the voices again. But this time, they were not discussing our movements from a distance. They were calling to us directly, trying to convince members of our group to leave the safety of our campsite and come into the darkness. The voices claimed to be other reenactors who had become separated from their own group and needed our help. They knew the names of several people in our expedition and referenced specific details about our journey that made their claims seem plausible. But Robert and I recognized the voices from the night before, and we knew that this was some kind of trap or trick designed to lure us away from our group. The most chilling moment came when one of the voices called out to Margaret specifically, claiming to be her research partner from the university, and insisting that he had discovered evidence of an important historical artifact nearby. The voice knew details about Margaret's academic work that no stranger should have known, and for a moment even she seemed tempted to investigate. We managed to keep everyone together until morning, but it required constant vigilance and repeated reminders that nothing good could come from venturing into the darkness to meet mysterious strangers who claimed to need our help. The children were especially frightened by the voices calling to them, and several of the adults admitted later that they had felt an almost irresistible urge to respond to the calls. When we finally reached town the next day, we immediately contacted local law enforcement to report the theft and harassment we had experienced during our expedition. The sheriff listened to our account with a mixture of skepticism and concern, clearly having difficulty believing that we had been systematically stalked and robbed by people dressed as 1800s pioneers. But when we mentioned the specific location where the incidents had occurred, his expression changed dramatically. He explained that our group was not the first to report strange encounters in that particular area. Over the years, several other historical reenactment groups, hiking parties, and even some local residents had described similar experiences involving mysterious figures in period clothing who seemed to know far more about visitors than they should. The sheriff suggested that we might be dealing with a group of individuals who had become obsessed with Oregon Trail history to the point where they were living out some kind of elaborate fantasy in the wilderness. These people might be using their extensive historical knowledge to intimidate and rob visitors while maintaining the illusion that they were somehow connected to the original pioneer experience. But he also mentioned a darker possibility that had been discussed among local law enforcement. There had been several unexplained disappearances in the region over the years involving people who had last been seen hiking or camping in areas associated with Oregon Trail history. While there was no concrete evidence connecting these disappearances to the mysterious figures that visitors kept reporting, the correlation was troubling enough to warrant serious concern. we never recovered our stolen supplies or received any explanation for the harassment we had experienced during our expedition. The case remained open but inactive, with local authorities occasionally following up on similar reports but never making any arrests or gathering definitive evidence about who was responsible for the ongoing incidents. I disbanded our reenactment group after that experience, and I have never participated in another Oregon Trail expedition. Several other members of our group reported having nightmares for months afterward, dreams involving the voices calling to them from the darkness and mysterious figures in period clothing who seemed to know intimate details about their personal lives. Margaret continued her historical research for a while, but she eventually abandoned her Oregon Trail project as well. She told me later that she could no longer read accounts of pioneer tragedies without hearing those voices from the wilderness, and that the entire subject had become too psychologically disturbing for her to continue studying. The children in our group were perhaps affected most severely by the experience. Several of them developed anxiety about camping or spending time outdoors, and their parents reported that they would wake up in the middle of the night claiming to hear voices calling their names from outside their bedrooms. I still believe that historical reenactments can be valuable educational experiences when conducted safely and appropriately. But I also know that there are some places and some periods of history that should be left undisturbed. The Oregon Trail represents one of the most challenging and tragic chapters in American pioneer history, involving thousands of deaths, countless hardships, and mysteries that have never been solved. Perhaps some of those mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Perhaps the voices we heard in the darkness were echoes of tragedies that occurred more than 150 years ago, still playing out in places where the boundary between past and present has become dangerously thin. Or perhaps we encountered something far more concrete and threatening. A group of people who have become so obsessed with recreating the past that they have lost touch with the present. Either way, I learned that there are limits to how authentic a historical experience should be, and that some parts of history are too dangerous to relive. The Oregon Trail claimed thousands of lives during the years of westward migration, and it may still be claiming lives today. I urge anyone interested in Oregon Trail history to study it from the safety of libraries and museums rather than venturing into the wilderness areas where those original tragedies occurred. Some experiences are meant to remain in the past, and some voices are meant to remain silent. The lessons of history are important, but they should never come at the cost of modern lives and safety. The trail west was difficult enough for the original pioneers who had no choice but to travel it. Those of us who do have a choice should choose wisely. Working maintenance at Crater Lake during the off-season means months of complete isolation. It is just you, the snow, and that impossibly deep water. But in February of 2023, I realized I was not as alone as I thought. My name is Christopher, and for 12 years I have been part of the park maintenance crew that keeps Crater Lake National Park running when the tourists are gone and the roads are buried under 15 feet of snow. Most people do not realize what it takes to maintain a place like Crater Lake through the winter months. We are talking about one of the most remote locations in Oregon, accessible only by snowcat or skis for nearly 6 months of the year. The park officially closes to vehicle traffic in November, and we do not see regular visitors again until late May or June. During those winter months, only a skeleton crew of maintenance workers, rangers, and emergency personnel remain on site. I have always loved the isolation that comes with winter work at Crater Lake. There is something peaceful about being surrounded by pristine wilderness, with nothing but the sound of wind through the pine trees and the occasional crack of ice shifting on the lake surface. The work is hard, physical labor and brutal conditions, but it has always been worth it for the solitude and the connection to one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Our crew of 4 was responsible for maintaining the visitor center, the lodge facilities, and the critical infrastructure that keeps the park operational during the winter closure. We lived in staff quarters at the rim, isolated from the outside world for weeks at a time. Communication with the outside was limited to radio contact with park headquarters and emergency services, and even that was often unreliable due to weather conditions and the mountainous terrain. The incident began during one of the worst blizzards I have ever experienced at the lake. We had been dealing with a series of winter storms that had dumped more than 8 feet of fresh snow in less than a week. The wind was howling constantly, creating whiteout conditions that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. We were essentially trapped in our quarters, waiting for the weather to break so we could assess the damage to park facilities. It was during the 3rd night of the storm that I first heard the sounds. I was lying in my bunk, listening to the wind rattling the windows, when I became aware of something else mixed in with the storm noise. It sounded like voices, multiple people talking in urgent, hushed tones. At first, I assumed it was one of my co-workers using a radio or maybe watching something on their tablet. But when I got up to investigate, I found that everyone else was sound asleep. I returned to my bunk, telling myself that I had been hearing things. The isolation and constant storm noise could play tricks on your mind, and I had experienced auditory hallucinations during previous winter assignments. But the voices continued, becoming clearer and more distinct as I lay there listening. They seemed to be coming from outside the building, somewhere in the storm. The next morning, when the wind finally died down enough for us to venture outside, I mentioned what I had heard to my supervisor. He listened with the kind of patient attention that suggested he had dealt with similar reports before. He explained that the extreme isolation and sensory deprivation of winter work could cause people to hear things that were not there, and that it was nothing to be concerned about unless it interfered with my work performance. But I knew what I had heard, and it had not sounded like a hallucination. The voices had been too clear, too consistent, too purposeful. They had been discussing something specific, though I could not make out the exact words. More disturbing, they had seemed to be moving around the building as if a group of people were conducting some kind of patrol or search in the middle of a blizzard. Over the next few days, as we worked to clear snow from the visitor center and assess storm damage to park facilities, I found myself constantly listening for the voices. I did not hear them during the day, but every night they returned. Always the same pattern, starting sometime after midnight and continuing until just before dawn. Always the same urgent, hushed tones, as if people were discussing something they did not want to be overheard. The other members of our crew did not report hearing anything unusual, which made me question my own sanity. I began to wonder if the isolation was affecting me more than I had realized. I had worked winter assignments at Crater Lake for over a decade, but this was the most severe weather I had ever experienced, and we had been cut off from outside contact for longer than usual due to the repeated storms. But my doubts about what I was hearing ended abruptly during my 4th night at the lake. I was lying awake, listening to the voices outside, when I heard something that made my blood freeze. One of the voices clearly said my name, not shouting it, not calling out to me, but discussing me in the same hushed tone they used for everything else. "Christopher is in the East Wing," the voice said, as clearly as if someone had been standing next to my bed. I sat up immediately, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anger. Someone was outside our building in the middle of a blizzard, talking about me specifically. I got out of bed, pulled on my winter gear, and grabbed a powerful flashlight from my equipment kit. I was going to find out who was out there and what they wanted. The moment I stepped outside, I realized how foolish I was being. The storm was still raging, though not as violently as the previous nights. The temperature was well below zero, and the wind chill made it feel even colder. No rational person would be outside in these conditions unless they were in immediate danger. but I could still hear the voices coming from somewhere near the visitor center. I followed the sound, moving carefully through knee-deep snow and using my flashlight to avoid obstacles buried under the drifts. The voices seemed to be coming from the area around the main visitor center building, but as I got closer, they seemed to move away, always staying just at the edge of my hearing range. I spent nearly an hour searching through the storm, following the voices as they led me in a rough circle around the RIM facilities. My flashlight beam revealed nothing but wind-blown snow and the dark shapes of buildings and trees. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone else had been moving through the area. But the voices continued, always just ahead of me, always just out of reach. Eventually, the cold forced me to give up the search and return to the staff quarters. I was shivering uncontrollably, and I knew I was risking frostbite by staying outside any longer. But as I reached the door to our building, I heard something that confirmed my worst fears. The voices were now coming from behind me, discussing my search in the same hushed tones they had used earlier. "He knows we are here," one voice said. "What should we do about that?" asked another. The conversation continued, but I could not make out the rest as I fumbled with the door lock and rushed inside to the warmth and safety of the building. The next morning, I told my supervisor everything that had happened during my late-night search. I expected him to be concerned about my mental state, or at least worried that I was suffering from severe cabin fever. Instead, he listened with a grim expression that suggested he knew more than he had been willing to share previously. When I finished my account, he was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the snow-covered landscape around the lake. Finally, he turned back to me and said that I was not the first maintenance worker to report hearing voices during winter assignments at Crater Lake. Over the years, several other employees had described similar experiences, always during the most severe weather, always during the deepest isolation of the winter months. He explained that the Park Service had never been able to find any explanation for the reports. There were no records of unauthorized people in the park during winter closures, no evidence of camps or shelters that might house individuals living off the grid. The voices seemed to appear only during the worst weather, when conditions would make survival nearly impossible for anyone caught outside without proper shelter. Some employees had theorized that the voices were related to the tragic history of Crater Lake, where numerous people had died over the years in accidents, suicides, and disappearances. The extreme isolation and harsh winter conditions might somehow amplify psychic impressions left by those who had perished at the lake. Others suggested that the voices might be connected to the Native American legends about Crater Lake being a gateway to the spirit world. But my supervisor also shared a more disturbing possibility that had been discussed among long-term park employees. There had been reports, never officially confirmed, of people living in the wilderness areas around Crater Lake during winter months. Individuals who had chosen to disconnect entirely from civilized society, surviving in conditions that would kill most people within hours. These hypothetical hermits would have intimate knowledge of the park layout, the location of maintenance facilities, and the schedules followed by winter crews. They might observe park employees from a distance, gathering information for reasons no one could understand. The harsh winter conditions would make detection nearly impossible, as their tracks would be quickly covered by snow and wind. The conversation with my supervisor did nothing to ease my fears about what I had been hearing. If anything, it made the situation worse by confirming that other people had experienced similar encounters. I was not losing my mind, but I was also not dealing with anything that had a rational explanation. Over the remaining weeks of my winter assignment, I continued to hear the voices on a regular basis. They seemed to be monitoring our activities, discussing our work schedules and personal habits with an attention to detail that was deeply unsettling. I began to feel like I was living under constant surveillance, watched by unseen observers who knew everything about my daily routine. The voices followed me when I worked alone in remote areas of the park, always staying just out of sight but close enough to make their presence known. They seemed to know when I was carrying my radio and when I was beyond the range of communication with other park employees. During those times, their conversations became more detailed and more threatening. On one particularly disturbing occasion, I heard them discussing the layout of the staff quarters, including specific details about which rooms were occupied and which were empty. They knew where I slept, where I kept my personal belongings, and what my work schedule would be for the following week. The level of surveillance implied by their knowledge was terrifying. I began taking precautions that would have seemed paranoid under normal circumstances. I varied my work routes and schedules as much as possible. I never worked alone in remote areas without first checking in with other crew members. I kept emergency supplies with me at all times, including extra food, water, and cold weather gear. But the voices seemed to adapt to my precautions, always staying one step ahead of my attempts to avoid them. They began appearing in areas where I had never heard them before, including inside park buildings where they should not have been able to operate without being detected by other employees. The final incident occurred during my last week at the lake. I was conducting a routine inspection of the visitor center heating system when I heard voices coming from somewhere inside the building. They were discussing a plan to approach me directly, to make contact rather than simply observing from a distance. I immediately radioed my supervisor and requested backup. But by the time another crew member arrived, the voices had stopped. A thorough search of the building revealed no signs of intruders, no evidence that anyone had been inside who should not have been there. My supervisor arranged for me to leave the park 2 days early, officially due to a family emergency, but actually because he was concerned about my psychological state. I was relieved to go, and I have never returned to Crater Lake for a winter assignment. I still do not know what I was hearing during those weeks of isolation at the lake. The official explanation is that extreme stress and sensory deprivation caused me to experience auditory hallucinations. But I know the difference between imagination and reality, and what I heard was real. There is something in the wilderness around Crater Lake that watches and waits during the winter months. Something that knows the park better than the people who work there. Something that monitors human activity with an intelligence and purpose that defies explanation. Whether it is living people who have chosen to exist outside civilized society or something else entirely, I cannot say. All I know is that Crater Lake is not as empty during the winter as it appears to be. There are observers in those snow-covered forests, watchers who know your every move and discuss your activities in hushed, urgent voices that carry on the winter wind. I have transferred to a different park, one that does not require winter isolation assignments. I sleep better now knowing that I am not being watched by unseen eyes or discussed by voices that should not exist. But sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind is howling outside my window, I think I can still hear them calling my name. Most people do not know that Portland sits on top of hundreds of miles of forgotten tunnels and abandoned spaces. I made it my mission to explore every single one of them, until I found something down there that was exploring me back. My name is Madison, and for 3 years I have been documenting the hidden underground network that runs beneath the city. What started as a hobby became an obsession, and eventually became a nightmare that I am still trying to forget. I discovered urban exploration during my second year at Portland State University. A friend mentioned the Shanghai tunnels, those infamous passages that supposedly ran beneath Old Town. Most people dismissed them as tourist folklore, but I was intrigued by the possibility that an entire hidden world existed right under our feet. I started researching the history, mapping the known entrances, and planning my first descent into the underground. The initial explorations were incredible. I found myself in forgotten basements, abandoned utility tunnels, and steam passages that had been sealed off for decades. Each discovery felt like uncovering a piece of Portland history that had been deliberately hidden from the world above. I documented everything with photographs and detailed notes, creating maps of the underground network that grew more complex with each expedition. I developed techniques for accessing the tunnels safely. I learned to pick locks, to read architectural plans, and to identify which manholes led to active infrastructure versus abandoned passages. I invested in professional equipment including headlamps, climbing gear, and waterproof cameras. I established rules for myself, never exploring alone, always leaving detailed plans with friends and maintaining emergency communication protocols. But as my explorations became more ambitious, I began to bend those safety rules. The most interesting discoveries always seemed to require solo missions into areas that other urban explorers avoided. I told myself that my experience made me capable of handling situations that would be dangerous for beginners. I was wrong about that, and my arrogance nearly cost me everything. The incident happened in early March during an exploration of a tunnel system beneath the industrial district on the east side. I had been mapping this particular network for weeks, working methodically through connected passages that seemed to extend much farther than any official records indicated. The tunnels were old, probably dating back to the early 1900s, with brick walls and arched ceilings that showed the craftsmanship of a different era. I was about 2 hours into the exploration, working my way through a section that I had never accessed before, when I noticed something unusual. The tunnels in this area showed signs of recent activity. There were fresh footprints in the dust, improvised lighting fixtures strung along the walls, and crude furniture made from salvaged materials. Someone was living down there, and they had been for quite some time. My first instinct was to turn back immediately. Encountering homeless camps in urban exploration was not uncommon, but it required extreme caution. These were people who had been pushed to the margins of society, and they often viewed explorers as threats to their safety and security. I knew the smart thing to do was to retreat and find a different route for my mapping project. But curiosity got the better of me. The living space was more elaborate than anything I had seen before. There were multiple rooms connected by carefully maintained passages with evidence of electrical work and plumbing modifications that must have required considerable skill and planning. This was not a temporary shelter, but a permanent underground community that had somehow remained hidden from city authorities. I continued deeper into the inhabited section, moving as quietly as possible and documenting everything with my camera. The construction was impressive, with reinforced walls, drainage systems, and ventilation shafts that had been carefully integrated into the existing tunnel structure. Whoever lived here had spent years developing this space, and they clearly intended to stay. That was when I heard the voices. They were coming from somewhere ahead of me, echoing through the passages in a way that made it impossible to determine their exact location or distance. I immediately turned off my headlamp and pressed myself against the tunnel wall, trying to become invisible in the darkness. The voices were male, at least 2 different speakers, and they were discussing something in urgent, hushed tones. I could not make out the specific words, but the tone was definitely threatening. They were angry about something, and that anger seemed to be directed at an intruder in their space. It took me several seconds to realize that they were talking about me. They knew I was there, and they were planning to do something about it. I started moving back toward the way I had come, but the voices seemed to be getting closer. The tunnel acoustics made it impossible to determine which direction they were approaching from, and I realized that I might have already been cut off from my planned escape route. I was in their territory, surrounded by people who viewed my presence as a direct threat to their safety and security. I found a side passage that I had not explored and decided to hide there until the voices moved away. But as I crouched in the darkness, I began to hear other sounds that made my situation much worse. There were more voices coming from different directions, and they seemed to be coordinating some kind of search pattern. They were not just looking for me, they were hunting me. The realization that I was being systematically tracked through the tunnel system triggered a panic response that I had never experienced before. My heart was racing. My breathing became rapid and shallow, and my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely operate my equipment. I was trapped underground with an unknown number of people who clearly meant me harm, and I had no way to call for help. I forced myself to stay calm and think strategically about my situation. I had been mapping these tunnels for weeks, so I knew the general layout better than I would have in a completely unfamiliar location. There were multiple exit points, and if I could avoid the search parties, I might be able to reach one of them before being caught. But I would have to move quickly and quietly, and I could not afford to make any mistakes. I started moving through the side passages, using my knowledge of the tunnel layout to stay ahead of the voices. But the underground community clearly knew their territory much better than I did. Every time I thought I had found a clear path to an exit, I would hear voices blocking that route. They were forcing me deeper into the tunnel system, away from the exits I knew about and into areas that I had never explored. The hunt continued for what felt like hours. I moved through passage after passage, always listening for voices, always looking for a way out that was not being watched. My equipment was running low on battery power, and I knew that once my lights failed, I would be completely helpless in the darkness. The psychological pressure was overwhelming, and I began to make increasingly desperate decisions. I found myself in a section of tunnel that was partially flooded, with several inches of standing water covering the floor. The water was ice cold and had a smell that suggested it was not just groundwater, but sewage or industrial runoff that had been accumulating for years. I waded through it anyway, hoping that the searchers would be reluctant to follow me into such unpleasant conditions. The flooded section led to a junction with several branching passages, and for the first time in hours, I could not hear any voices nearby. I chose the passage that seemed to angle upward, hoping it would lead me back towards street level and a possible exit. But after following it for several hundred yards, I found myself at a dead end with no way forward. I was forced to backtrack through the flooded section, and when I reached the junction again, I could hear voices approaching from multiple directions. They had found my trail through the water, and they were closing in on my position. I had nowhere left to run, and my battery power was nearly exhausted. In desperation, I found a drainage pipe that was just large enough for me to crawl through. It was a tight fit, and the pipe was filled with debris and standing water, but it was my only option. I turned off my headlamp to conserve what little battery power remained and began crawling through complete darkness, guided only by the feel of the pipe walls around me. The pipe seemed to go on forever. My knees and elbows were scraped raw from crawling over rough concrete and metal debris. The water soaked through my clothes, and the cold began to affect my coordination and judgment. Several times I became stuck and had to force myself through openings that seemed too small for my body. But eventually I saw light ahead of me. The pipe opened into a storm drain that led to a culvert under a busy street. I could hear traffic above me, and I knew that I was finally close to escape. I crawled the last few yards and emerged into daylight, covered in filth and shaking from cold and exhaustion. I found myself in an industrial area on the east side of the river, several miles from where I had entered the tunnel system. I was disoriented and exhausted, but I was alive and free. I walked to the nearest business and called a friend to pick me up, making up a story about a bicycle accident to explain my condition. I never returned to urban exploration after that day, The experience taught me that there are spaces beneath the city that belong to people who have been forgotten by the world above, and those people will defend their territory with whatever means they have available. I had been lucky to escape, and I knew that luck would not protect me a second time. Sometimes I still think about the underground community I discovered. I wonder who they were, how they ended up living in those tunnels, and whether they are still there. But I will never try to find out. There are some secrets that are meant to remain hidden, and some places where outsiders are not welcome. The tunnels beneath Portland are vast and complex, full of history and mystery. But they are also home to people who have nowhere else to go, and those people deserve to be left in peace. Urban exploration taught me to respect the spaces I visited, and sometimes that respect means knowing when to stay away. In 22 years of Oregon State Police work, I have handled everything from domestic disputes to homicides. But what I encountered on Highway 101 near Bandon defied every protocol I had ever learned. My name is Tyler, and after 2 decades of law enforcement, I thought I had seen every type of criminal behavior and emergency situation that could occur on Oregon's highways. I was wrong about that, and what happened during my patrol shift last November still keeps me awake at night. Highway 101 runs along the entire Oregon coast, connecting small towns and tourist destinations through some of the most beautiful but also most isolated stretches of road in the Pacific Northwest. During the off-season, particularly in late fall and winter, traffic on the highway drops to almost nothing. You can drive for hours without seeing another vehicle, especially on the remote sections between Bandon and Gold Beach, where the road winds through dense forest and rocky coastline. I had been working the coastal patrol for 8 years, covering the stretch of Highway 101 from Coos Bay to the California border. It was generally quiet work, mostly involving traffic stops for speeding tourists and the occasional accident during storms when visibility dropped to near zero. The most serious incidents I typically dealt with were drunk drivers heading home from the coastal casinos and domestic disputes at some of the more isolated beach houses. The incident began during what should have been a routine patrol shift on a foggy November evening. I was driving southbound near Bandon around 10:30 in the evening when I received a radio call about a stranded motorist approximately 15 miles ahead of my position. The caller had used a cell phone to contact dispatch, reporting that their vehicle had broken down and that they were parked on the shoulder of the highway, waiting for assistance. This type of call was common along Highway 101, especially during the rainy season when older vehicles frequently experienced mechanical problems. My standard procedure was to respond to the location, assess the situation, and either provide assistance or coordinate with a tow truck company to get the stranded vehicle off the highway. As I drove toward the reported location, I noticed that the fog was becoming increasingly dense, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet in some areas. This was also typical for the Oregon coast during fall and winter, when warm ocean air collided with cooler land temperatures to create thick marine layers that could persist for hours. When I reached the coordinates provided by dispatch, I found no sign of a stranded vehicle or motorist. I parked my patrol car on the shoulder and activated my emergency lights, then began searching the immediate area for any evidence that someone had been there recently. I checked both sides of the highway, looked for tire tracks in the soft shoulder, and used my flashlight to examine the ditch areas where a vehicle might have gone off the road. After 20 minutes of searching, I radioed dispatch to report that I had found no trace of the reported stranded motorist. The dispatcher confirmed the coordinates and suggested that the caller might have been confused about their exact location, which was also common in areas where cell phone coverage was spotty and GPS signals could be unreliable. I was preparing to expand my search to adjacent areas when I noticed headlights approaching from the north. As the vehicle got closer, I could see that it was moving unusually slowly barely maintaining highway speed despite the fact that this particular section of road was straight and relatively safe even in foggy conditions. The vehicle passed my position without stopping, which struck me as odd since most drivers would at least slow down or pull over when they saw a patrol car with emergency lights activated. As the tail lights disappeared into the fog ahead of me, I decided to follow and conduct a routine traffic stop to see if the driver was experiencing problems or needed assistance. I caught up with the vehicle after about 2 miles, but when I activated my overhead lights to signal the driver to pull over, the car did not respond. It continued traveling at the same slow speed, maintaining its position in the right lane without acknowledging my presence. I radioed in my position and license plate number, but dispatch reported that the plate did not match any vehicle in their database. Over the next several miles, I followed the vehicle while repeatedly activating my siren and using my public address system to instruct the driver to pull over. The car showed no response to any of my attempts to make contact, continuing to travel at exactly 35 miles per hour despite the posted speed limit of 55 miles per hour. As we continued south, I began to notice other unusual aspects of the situation. The vehicle itself appeared to be an older model sedan, possibly from the 1980s or early 1990s, but it was in remarkably good condition despite its apparent age. The taillights were bright and clear, the body showed no signs of rust or damage, and the exhaust was clean without any visible smoke or emissions. More disturbing, I could not see any occupants inside the vehicle despite being directly behind it, with my headlights providing illumination through the rear window. The car appeared to be driving itself, maintaining perfect lane control and consistent speed without any visible human intervention. After following the vehicle for nearly 10 miles, I made the decision to attempt a pit maneuver to force it to stop. This was an extreme measure, but I was growing increasingly concerned about the safety implications of a vehicle that was not responding to law enforcement signals and appeared to be operating without a driver. I positioned my patrol car alongside the rear quarter panel of the suspect vehicle and began to execute the maneuver. But at the moment of contact, something impossible happened. My patrol car passed directly through the other vehicle as if it were not there at all. I felt no impact, heard no sound of collision, and experienced no change in my vehicle's momentum or direction. I immediately pulled over to the side of the highway, my hands shaking as I tried to process what had just occurred. I sat in my patrol car for several minutes, checking my equipment and trying to determine if I was experiencing some kind of medical emergency or equipment malfunction that might explain what I had witnessed. I radioed dispatch to request backup and medical assistance, explaining that I was experiencing a situation that I could not adequately describe or understand. The dispatcher asked if I was injured or in immediate danger, and I honestly did not know how to answer. I was physically unharmed, but I was deeply shaken by an encounter that violated every law of physics and reality that I understood. While I waited for backup to arrive, I conducted a thorough inspection of my patrol car, looking for any sign of damage that might indicate I had actually collided with another vehicle. I found no evidence of impact, no scratches or dents, and no debris that might have come from another car. According to all physical evidence, I had not made contact with anything during my attempted PIT maneuver. When backup arrived 30 minutes later, I explained the situation to Sergeant Rodriguez, a 25-year veteran of the state police who had worked the coastal patrol longer than anyone in our unit. He listened to my account with a serious expression, asking detailed questions about the vehicle's appearance, behavior, and my attempts to make contact. When I finished my report, Rodriguez was quiet for several minutes before telling me something that changed my understanding of the entire incident. He explained that I was not the first officer to report encounters with phantom vehicles on Highway 101, particularly in the area between Bandon and Gold Beach where my incident had occurred. Over the years, several other officers had described similar experiences involving vehicles that appeared normal at first glance but exhibited impossible behavior when subjected to closer examination. These vehicles never responded to traffic stops, never pulled over despite extended pursuit, and sometimes seemed to vanish entirely when officers attempted to make physical contact. Rodriguez told me that the department had an unofficial policy of not discussing these incidents publicly, partly to avoid ridicule and partly because there was no rational explanation for what officers were witnessing. The reports were filed and documented, but no further investigation was conducted because there was no evidence of criminal activity and no apparent threat to public safety. He also shared some historical context that made the situation even more unsettling. The stretch of Highway 101 where these incidents occurred had been the site of numerous fatal accidents over the decades, including several cases where drivers had simply disappeared along with their vehicles. Search and rescue operations had found no trace of the missing drivers or cars despite extensive efforts involving multiple agencies and volunteer groups. Some of the missing persons cases dated back to the 1960s and 1970s when Highway 101 was even more isolated and dangerous than it is today. Families had reported that their loved ones had failed to arrive at their destinations after traveling this route, but no evidence was ever found to indicate what had happened to them. Rodriguez suggested that what I had encountered might be connected to these historical disappearances, though he admitted that he had no explanation for how such a connection might be possible. He recommended that I file a complete report of the incident, but advised me not to discuss it with other officers or civilians who might not understand the unique challenges of coastal patrol work. I followed his advice and filed a detailed report, but I also began conducting my own research into the history of Highway 101 and the missing persons cases that Rodriguez had mentioned. What I discovered was even more disturbing than the original incident. Over the past 50 years, at least 17 people had disappeared while traveling the section of Highway 101 between Bandon and Gold Beach. Their vehicles had never been found, despite extensive searches of the coastline, forest areas, and remote roads in the region. In several cases, witnesses had reported seeing the missing person's vehicle on the highway after they were supposed to have reached their destination, but these sightings were generally dismissed as cases of mistaken identity. Reading through these historical accounts, I began to wonder if what I had encountered was not a phantom vehicle, but rather evidence of some ongoing phenomenon that had been claiming travelers on this stretch of highway for decades. Perhaps the people who disappeared were still somehow present on the road, continuing their journeys in a form that was visible but not quite real. I requested a transfer to a different patrol area 6 months after the incident. I told my supervisors that I wanted new challenges and opportunities for professional development. But the truth was that I could no longer patrol Highway 101 without thinking about what I had encountered that foggy November night. I still drive the coastal highway occasionally when visiting family or taking vacation trips, but I am always aware of the other vehicles around me in ways I never was before. Sometimes, late at night when the fog is thick and visibility is poor, I think I see familiar taillights in my mirrors, always maintaining that same impossibly consistent speed and distance. I know that some of my fellow officers think I experienced a hallucination or some kind of stress-related episode. But I also know what I saw, and I know that Highway 101 holds secrets that go far beyond anything covered in police training or protocol manuals. The Oregon coast is beautiful, but it is also dangerous, and some of that danger cannot be addressed by conventional law enforcement methods. All I can do is continue serving and protecting to the best of my ability, while remaining aware that there are forces at work on these remote highways that I will never fully understand. I have been part of Mount Hood's search and rescue team for 6 years, and we have saved dozens of lives in those mountains. But our last mission in the wilderness area near government camp was not about saving anyone. It was about surviving what we found up there. My name is Brandon, and what happened during our February 2024 rescue operation changed my understanding of what exists in the high country around Oregon's most dangerous peak. Mount Hood is one of the most climbed mountains in North America, attracting thousands of hikers and climbers every year. It is also one of the most deadly, with an average of 3 to 4 fatalities annually, and dozens of rescue operations. Our team, Pacific Northwest Search and Rescue, responds to calls from county sheriffs when people go missing or get injured in the backcountry areas around the mountain. The mission began with a standard distress call on February 15th. A group of 3 experienced backcountry skiers had failed to return from a planned 2-day trip into the government camp wilderness area. Their emergency locator beacon had activated around 4:30 p.m., indicating they were in serious trouble somewhere in the vast expanse of forest and alpine terrain on the mountain's southwest slopes. Weather conditions were challenging but not impossible. Fresh snow had fallen during the previous 48 hours and temperatures were well below freezing. But visibility was good and winds were relatively calm. We assembled a team of 8 volunteers, including myself as team leader, and began organizing our search strategy based on the beacon's last known coordinates. The missing skiers were all local residents with extensive backcountry experience. Tom Bradley, 34, was a certified ski instructor who had been exploring Mount Hood's wilderness areas for over 10 years. Sarah Chen, 29, was an emergency room nurse who regularly participated in avalanche rescue training. Mark Stevens, 41, was a professional mountain guide who had summited Mount Hood more than 20 times. These were not inexperienced tourists who had gotten in over their heads. They were skilled outdoors enthusiasts who knew how to handle themselves in dangerous situations. The fact that their emergency beacon had been activated suggested they were dealing with something serious, possibly a severe injury or avalanche burial that prevented them from self-rescuing. We began our search at first light on February 16th, using snowmobiles to access the general area where the beacon signal had originated. The terrain in that section of Mount Hood is extremely challenging, with steep slopes, deep ravines, and dense forests that can hide hazards like tree wells and unstable snow conditions. The initial phase of our search followed standard protocols. We divided into 2 teams and began working systematic search patterns, using avalanche probes and rescue dogs to check areas where the missing skiers might be buried under snow. We also used GPS units to precisely navigate to the coordinates provided by their emergency beacon. After 4 hours of intensive searching, we found their camp. The 3 skiers had established a well-organized base camp in a sheltered area near a grove of large pine trees. Their tents were properly set up, their equipment was neatly arranged, and there were no signs of avalanche activity or other natural disasters that might explain their disappearance. But the camp had clearly been abandoned in a hurry. Food was still cooking on their camp stove, personal belongings were scattered around the site, and their sleeping bags were thrown aside as if they had been sleeping when something forced them to leave immediately. Most disturbing, we found clear evidence that they had left the camp during the night, in sub-zero temperatures and dangerous conditions that no experienced backcountry traveler would willingly venture into. We followed their tracks leading away from the camp and immediately realized that something was very wrong. The tracks showed that all 3 skiers had been moving together in a tight group, but they were not following any logical route towards safety. Instead, they appeared to be heading deeper into the wilderness, toward terrain that was more dangerous and further from any possible rescue or shelter. The tracks also showed signs that the skiers had been moving unusually fast, almost running on their skis despite poor visibility and hazardous conditions. There were several places where one or more of them had fallen. but they had gotten up immediately and continued moving in the same direction, as if they were fleeing from something behind them. After following the trail for nearly 2 miles, we came to an area where the tracks suddenly stopped. Not gradually, as if the skiers had removed their skis to continue on foot, but abruptly in the middle of an open slope where there was no logical reason for them to change direction or method of travel. The snow around the end of the ski tracks was disturbed in ways that we could not explain. There were marks and impressions that did not match any equipment the skiers had been carrying, and the snow itself seemed to have been compressed by something much heavier than 3 people on skis. We spent the rest of that day expanding our search in all directions from where the tracks ended, but we found no further sign of the missing skiers. We used avalanche probes to check for possible burial sites, thermal imaging equipment to look for body heat signatures, and trained search dogs to try to pick up human scent traces. As evening approached, we established our own camp near the location where the ski tracks had ended. Standard protocol for multi-day search operations required us to maintain a base camp that could serve as a command post and staging area for continued searching. We set up our tents, prepared hot meals, and organized watch schedules for the night. It was during the first watch, around 11:30 p.m., that we encountered the phenomena that transformed our rescue mission into something entirely different. I was on duty with Jake Morrison, a veteran rescue volunteer with over 15 years of mountain experience, when we first heard the sounds. They started as distant voices, barely audible over the wind through the pine trees. At first, we assumed they were coming from other members of our team, perhaps talking quietly in their tents. But when we checked, we found that everyone else was asleep and the voices were coming from somewhere outside our camp. The voices sounded like people calling for help, which would have been consistent with finding the missing skiers. But there was something wrong with the calls. They seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, and they had an echoing quality that did not match the acoustics of the area where we were camped. Jake and I grabbed our flashlights and emergency medical supplies and began moving toward the source of the voices, following standard procedures for responding to calls for help in the wilderness. But as we got closer to where the sounds seemed to be coming from, they would move, always staying just at the edge of our hearing range. We spent nearly an hour following the voices through the forest, but we never found anyone who might have been calling for help. The sounds led us in a rough circle around our camp, always seeming to come from just ahead of us, but never getting closer or more distinct. When we returned to camp, we discovered that our tents had been moved. Not dramatically, and not in a way that suggested deliberate vandalism, but they were definitely in different positions than where we had set them up earlier in the evening. Our equipment had also been rearranged, with items moved from their original locations and placed in neat piles that none of our team members remembered creating. The other members of our search team had been awakened by the disturbance, and they had their own reports of unusual activity. Several people described feeling as if they were being watched while trying to sleep, and 2 team members reported seeing figures moving between the trees just outside the circle of light cast by our camp lanterns. We conducted a thorough perimeter check looking for any evidence of who might have been in our camp while Jake and I were following the voices. We found footprints in the snow around our tents, but they were not from any of our team members. The prints appeared to be from bare feet, which made no sense given the sub-zero temperatures and deep snow conditions. At that point, we made the decision to terminate the search operation and evacuate our team from the mountain. As experienced rescue volunteers, we were trained to recognize when conditions had become too dangerous to continue, and the unexplained activity around our camp clearly represented a threat to our safety. But our evacuation was complicated by equipment failures that had not been present earlier in the mission. Our GPS units began providing inconsistent readings, making it difficult to navigate back to our vehicles. Our radio communications with base camp became intermittent and filled with static. Even our emergency backup equipment seemed to be affected by whatever was causing the other malfunctions. The return trip to our staging area took nearly twice as long as expected, as we were forced to rely on compass navigation and visual landmarks to find our way through terrain that several of our team members had traveled many times before. Throughout the descent, we continued to hear the voices calling from various locations around us, but we made no attempt to investigate or respond. When we finally reached our vehicles and re-established communication with county emergency services, we learned that the search for the 3 missing skiers had been called off. Their bodies had been found early that morning by a different search team working in an area more than 5 miles from where we had been searching. The circumstances of their deaths raised questions that were never adequately answered. All 3 bodies were found together in a location that made no logical sense given the evidence we had found at their camp and along their ski trail. They appeared to have died from exposure, but they were discovered without any of their survival equipment, including the heavy winter clothing they had been wearing when they left their camp. Most disturbing, the location where their bodies were found was accessible only by traveling through terrain that would have been extremely difficult and dangerous to navigate at night, especially without proper equipment. There was no explanation for how or why they had made such a journey, or what had happened to their skis, packs, and other gear. The official incident report concluded that the 3 skiers had become disoriented during the night and had made poor decisions that led to their deaths from exposure. But those of us who had been involved in the search knew that the explanation did not account for the evidence we had observed or the unusual phenomena we had encountered. I submitted a detailed report describing everything our team had experienced during the search operation. But I was advised by county officials that such details would not be helpful to the families of the deceased and might create unnecessary public concern about safety in the Mount Hood Wilderness area. I have not participated in any search and rescue operations on Mount Hood since that mission. I transferred to a team that works primarily in lower elevation areas, telling my supervisors that I wanted to focus on urban rescue operations. But the truth is that I can no longer feel comfortable in the high country around Mount Hood, knowing that there are things up there that do not have rational explanations. The mountain continues to attract thousands of climbers and hikers every year in search, and rescue teams continue to respond when people get into trouble in the wilderness areas. But I know that some of the dangers they face cannot be addressed by training, equipment, or experience, and that Mount Hood holds secrets that go far beyond the well-documented risks of avalanches, weather, and difficult terrain. Sometimes the people who go missing in those mountains encounter something other than natural hazards, and sometimes the rescue teams sent to find them discover that they are not alone in the wilderness after all.